Civilizations rose with precision and vanished without clear explanation. Massive structures aligned with unknown principles, symbols shared across distant lands, and gaps in history where answers should be. Who built this? Why did it disappear? What remains unseen? Join us on a 3-hour journey to the edges of human memory as we walk the ruins, the temples, the buried cities, and the sacred heights of the ancient world, a world that continues to challenge everything we thought we knew. Somewhere in the rocky interior of northwestern Libya, far from the Mediterranean coast and the bustling trade routes of antiquity, a structure rises from the earth that defies simple explanation. It does not announce itself. It emerges from the arid landscape with a quiet authority, circular, commanding, monumental, as though it has always been here and always will be, long after the last human hand has turned to dust. Qasr al-Haj. The name is almost a whisper in the wind. It is a place that does not appear in most Western histories. It does not draw the tourist caravans. It sits in the Jabal Nafusa region, the Berber highlands of western Libya, and it watches the centuries pass with something that feels, if you allow yourself the thought, like patience. Stand before its outer wall, and you understand immediately that this is not a ruin. This is an architecture of intention. The massive circular structure stretches roughly 50 meters in diameter, its outer walls rising several stories, thick, dry stone masonry, laid with extraordinary precision. There are no decorative flourishes here, no imperial inscriptions, no conquering hero's proclamation carved above the gate. What exists instead is pure function, stripped to its essence, and yet somehow more beautiful for it. Scholars believe Qasr al-Haj was built during the medieval Islamic period, constructed sometime around the 12th century, attributed traditionally to a scholar named Abu Hatim al-Malzuzi. Its purpose, the historical consensus tells us, was agricultural, a communal granary, a fortified storehouse for the surrounding Berber communities, who would deposit their olive oil, grain, and other harvests in the vaulted chambers that line its interior circumference, tier upon tier, rising skyward like a library of survival. And yet, pause on that thought. A library of survival. You walk through the single entrance, a darkened threshold that narrows the world around you into one slim passage of shadow and stone, and you emerge into a central courtyard open to the sky. The interior is extraordinary. Rows of vaulted storage rooms, perhaps 114 in total, are stacked in multiple stories around the perimeter, each chamber accessible by a wooden beam and ladder system, the architectural logic of an agrarian civilization expressed in stone and shadow. The light falls in shafts from above. The silence is absolute. Imagine carrying the weight of your harvest here. Walking through this same entrance, in the same shadow, breathing the same dust-scented air. Your survival, and the survival of your family, your village, your children, compressed into clay jars and woven sacks, stored in one of those small rectangular chambers above. The act of placing food here was not merely practical. It was an act of faith. Faith in the structure, faith in the community, faith in tomorrow. But communities require governance, and governance requires trust, and trust, in the ancient and medieval world, required walls. Qasr al-Haj is not just a granary. It is a statement about collective life, about the shared stakes of survival in a landscape that offers little forgiveness. The Berber peoples of the Jabal Nafusa existed largely outside the reach of the great empires, Roman, Byzantine, later Arab, maintaining their own languages, their own traditions, their own extraordinarily resilient ways of organizing human existence. Qasr al-Haj is a monument to that resilience, architecture as philosophy. And yet the questions accumulate. Who truly commissioned this structure? And was the attribution to Abu Hatim al-Mawzuzi a genuine historical memory or a later mythologizing? The dating of dry stone structures without organic materials is notoriously imprecise. Some researchers have suggested elements of the construction tradition extend far earlier than the medieval period, that Qasr al-Haj may be built on a site or in a style that echoes far older Berber architectural practices whose origins remain poorly documented. The circular plan, the communal storage logic, these appear in fragmentary form across the Maghreb in patterns that suggest not invention, but evolution, not a single brilliant mind, but an accumulated inheritance of design. There are other Qasr structures scattered across the region, fortified granaries known as gorfas in Tunisia, the Igirm of the Atlas Mountains in Morocco, forming a loose constellation of related architectural ideas stretching across North Africa. Qasr al-Haj belongs to this tradition, but it is among the most dramatic and best preserved examples, and its sheer scale raises the question of what level of social organization and surplus wealth was required to construct it. This was not the work of a handful of families. This was a community project of remarkable ambition. Walk the upper levels, if you dare the narrow passes. Look down into the courtyard below, this open eye of sky and stone, and consider the centuries of hands that deposited and withdrew, that argued over shares and settled disputes, that watched their oil jars fill and empty across the rhythms of drought and abundance. Consider that this structure survived the collapse of surrounding empires, survived conflicts, survived the long erosion of time, because the community that built it continued to need it, continued to maintain it, continued to understand its value. In a world that increasingly prizes the individual, the solitary act of genius, the single visionary, Qasr al-Haj stands as a rebuke. It is a monument to something older and perhaps more fundamental, the understanding that survival is a collective enterprise, that the wall that protects your neighbor's grain protects your own. And yet, even knowing all this, even holding all these facts in the mind, the structure retains its mystery. The silence of the interior is not the silence of an empty place. It is the silence of a place that has held things, stored things, kept things safe. What else did these people keep? What was stored in those upper chambers that no jar could contain? What memories, what agreements, what sacred understandings that has since dissolved into the desert air? The walls know. They are not telling. There is a moment, somewhere in the jungle lowlands of Veracruz, Mexico, when the world goes quiet in a particular way. The heat presses down with a physical weight. The green canopy closes above, and then, emerging from the undergrowth with an almost theatrical suddenness, stone, massive, carved, monumental stone, faces staring back at you from the deep past. El-Azuzul is not a household name. It does not appear on the major tourism maps alongside the pyramids of Teotihuacan or the stone cities of the Maya. It sits near the site of San Lorenzo, one of the earliest and most powerful Olmec centers in Mesoamerica, and it holds, within its modest archaeological footprint, some of the most provocative sculptural discoveries ever made in the Western Hemisphere. The Olmec. Even the name carries weight, the Nahuatl word meaning, roughly, rubber people, a name given to them by later cultures, not by themselves. The Olmec have no agreed-upon autonym in the historical record. They are, in many ways, a civilization defined by what they left behind rather than what they said about themselves. And what they left behind at Azuzul is staggering. 2 colossal basalt figures were discovered here, side by side, kneeling, facing outward with an expression that is difficult to categorize. They are young men, or beings rendered in the likeness of young men, their faces broad, their features rendered with the characteristic Olmec precision that manages to be simultaneously realistic and otherworldly. They are often called the twins, and the interpretation that immediately arises is mythological. These figures may represent the hero twins, the divine brothers who appear in the later Mesoamerican cosmological tradition, most famously recorded in the Quiches Maya Popol Vuh, beings who descend into the underworld, defeat death itself, and rise again as the sun and moon. If that connection is correct, and it remains debated, contested, tantalizing, then Azuzul is evidence of something extraordinary. It would suggest that the mythological framework that would later become foundational to Maya, Aztec, and other Mesoamerican cultures was already being articulated in stone more than 3,000 years ago, during the height of Olmec civilization, around 900 BCE or earlier. The hero twins, staring out from the Veracruz jungle, ancient beyond imagining. But there is more. Positioned before the 2 kneeling figures at the original time of discovery were 2 serpent figures, coiled, powerful, their bodies rendered with the same monumental ambition as the twins themselves. The serpent in Mesoamerican cosmology is never merely a serpent. It is the feathered serpent, the earth monster, the vehicle of divine energy, the boundary between worlds. The arrangement, 2 human or divine figures facing 2 serpentine presences, reads, to the eyes of mythologists, like a scene frozen in narrative time, a moment captured, an act interrupted. What act? What moment? You stand before these figures now, or imagine yourself standing there in the filtered green light, the insects calling from the canopy, the humidity closing around you like a second skin, and you feel the weight of the unresolved. The Olmec left no written texts that have been deciphered. The glyphic inscriptions associated with Olmec culture remain, after decades of study, largely resistant to systematic interpretation. We cannot ask these figures what they mean. We cannot read the ritual manuals that may have accompanied their placement. We can only look and wonder. The San Lorenzo region of Veracruz was, during the Olmec apogee, a center of remarkable power and artistic production. The great, colossal heads of San Lorenzo, massive basalt portraits of rulers or deities, each weighing many tons, transported from volcanic quarries dozens of kilometers away, attest to a level of political organization, labor mobilization, and artistic ambition that should by rights be far more celebrated in the global story of human civilization. These were not simple people. They were engineers, artists, theologians, administrators of complex societies. The world they created at sites like San Lorenzo and Azuzul was as sophisticated, in its own way, as anything being produced contemporaneously in the Mediterranean or Mesopotamia. And Azuzul sits at the edge of that world, perhaps a satellite site, perhaps a ritual precinct, perhaps something harder to categorize. The kneeling twins suggest a ceremonial function, sacred space, a place where the boundary between the human and the divine grew thin, where the mythology of creation and cosmic struggle was not merely told but enacted, represented, made physically real in stone. The basalt from which the figures were carved came from the Tuxtla Mountains, more than 60 kilometers away. Someone decided to move this stone. Someone organized the labor, the logistics, the sacred intent. Someone knew exactly what these figures needed to look like: the angle of the knee, the expression of the face, the positioning in relation to the serpents. That knowledge came from somewhere. It was transmitted, refined, accumulated. It was, in every meaningful sense of the word, a tradition that ended, or transformed, or went underground, and that we are only beginning to excavate from the silence it left behind. What did the people who stood before these figures believe was happening? What transaction, what communion, what cosmic negotiation was being invoked in this clearing in the jungle? The twins stare outward. The serpents coil. The jungle reclaims its ground slowly, patiently, season after season. And the questions remain, as they have always remained, suspended in the hot green air of a world we can see but not quite touch. High above the city of Cusco, where the altitude presses against the lungs, and the sky takes on the particular deep blue that belongs only to the Andean heights, there are places that the Inca did not build so much as reveal. Places where the living rock itself was shaped, carved, aligned, where the mountain was coaxed into a form that speaks of cosmology and kingship, of the sacred geography of a civilization that understood the world in ways we are still struggling to articulate. Inkilltambo is one of these places. Its name echoes in the throat like something ancient. It sits northeast of Cusco, carved directly into the living bedrock of the mountainside, a complex of carved stone platforms, niches, channels, thrones, and ceremonial spaces that seem to flow into one another with a logic that is architectural and ritual at once. It is not a temple in the sense that requires walls and a roof. It is a temple in the older sense, a sacred precinct, a temenos, a place cut apart from the ordinary world and dedicated to something beyond it. The Inca term tambo generally refers to a way station, a rest stop along the Great Road network, a point of administrative and logistical support in the vast infrastructure of Tawantinsuyu, the empire that stretched from modern Colombia to central Chile. But Inkilltambo is no ordinary way station. The complexity and deliberateness of its carved rock surfaces, the orientation of its carved thrones and channels, the presence of what appear to be astronomical alignments, all of this suggests a function that transcends the logistical. You sit, if you are lucky enough to visit, in one of the carved stone seats that emerge from the rock face like furniture grown from the mountain. The fit is astonishing. The rock conforms to the shape of a seated human body with an intimacy that feels almost personal, as though it were carved for someone specific, for a particular body that once occupied this exact space and looked out over this exact landscape. The valley of Cusco spreads below. The mountains rise on every horizon. The sky is enormous. Inca sacred geography was built around the concept of the huaca, a sacred object, place, or being infused with divine power. Rocks, mountains, springs, unusual formations, all could be huacas, nodes in a web of sacred meaning that covered the entire landscape of the Inca world. The system of ceques, imaginary lines radiating outward from the Coricancha, the great sun temple at the heart of Cusco, organized these sacred places into a ritual calendar, a cosmological map, a way of reading the landscape as text. Inkilltambo likely occupied a position within this system, its carved forms oriented and aligned in dialogue with the broader sacred geography of which it was a part. The carved channels at Inkilltambo are particularly evocative. They run across the rock surfaces with precision, narrow, smooth, clearly intentional. What flowed through them? The most frequently proposed answer is water. Ritual libations of chicha, the fermented corn beer that was central to Inca ceremonial life, or water drawn from sacred springs and poured across the sacred rock surfaces in acts of offering and communion. Water in the Andean world was not merely a physical substance, it was a living force, an agent of connection between the human and the divine, between the surface world and the underworld of Uku Pacha that lay beneath. But some researchers have proposed other functions, channels designed to direct the flow of blood from sacrificial offerings, channels whose configuration encoded astronomical or calendrical information, channels whose purpose was symbolic rather than functional, carved as a representation of the idea of flow itself. The ambiguity is characteristic. Inca sacred sites rarely submit to single interpretations. The carved thrones, Ushnu in Quechua, at Inkilltambo have attracted particular attention. The Ushnu was a platform from which the Inca emperor, who was himself divine, the son of Inti, the sun god, would perform public rituals, libations, proclamations, ceremonial acts that made visible the connection between cosmic order and imperial power. The carved throne at Inkilltambo, cut directly from the living rock rather than constructed from fitted stone blocks, carries a different quality from the great Ushnu platforms of the imperial plazas. This is a more intimate power, a more direct communion. Who sat here? At what moment in the long arc of Inca history? And what did they see, looking out from this carved rock seat across a landscape that their civilization understood as a living sacred text? The mountains were ancestors. The rivers were veins of the earth. The Seque lines connected this seat to the Coricancha in Cusco, to the other sacred places scattered across the Andean world, forming a web of meaning that encompassed an entire civilization's understanding of its place in the cosmos. That civilization was shattered with extraordinary violence in the 1530s, when Spanish forces under Francisco Pizarro conquered and dismantled Tawantinsuyu in one of history's most sudden and comprehensive imperial collapses. The sacred system was systematically destroyed, temples demolished, huacas desecrated, the Sique system deliberately obliterated. And yet, some things survived, precisely because they were the mountain itself. You cannot demolish a carved rock throne. You cannot carry away a channel cut into a cliff face. Inkilltambo endured, patient and high above the valley, waiting for those who could learn again to read what the mountain is saying. Whether we have yet truly learned that language remains, as with so much here, an open and humbling question. Before Rome, that is the sentence that matters. Before the legions, before the forum, before the emperors and the aqueducts, and the vast machinery of Latin civilization, there was another world in the Italian peninsula, a world of cities and trade networks and sacred rites and a language that sounds, to modern ears, like nothing else in the Indo-European family. A world that Rome absorbed and, in absorbing, nearly erased. The Etruscans, mysterious by reputation, magnificent by any honest reckoning. And nothing brings you closer to the living texture of Etruscan religious life than their votive figures. The thousands upon thousands of small clay and bronze figurines deposited at sanctuaries across central Italy, from roughly the 7th century BCE through the Roman period, as offerings to the gods, as acts of petition and gratitude, as physical embodiments of the relationship between the mortal and the divine. Hold one in your mind's eye. a small terracotta figure, perhaps 15 centimeters tall, depicting a human body, but not the idealized body of Greek sculpture. Something rawer, stranger, more honest. The surface of the figure is anatomically specific in ways that seem at first medical. A clay torso open to reveal the internal organs, modeled with care, a stomach, a liver, a uterus, a detached hand, a foot, an eye, a breast, a swaddled infant. These were not decorative objects. They were prayers made physical. The Etruscan world was saturated with divine presence. The gods were not distant Olympians, maintaining their remove while humans struggled below. They were close, immediate, interested in the specifics of human lives, in the health of a child, the success of a pregnancy, the recovery from a wound, the fertility of a field. And the votive deposit was the technology of this relationship. You came to the sanctuary, you brought your offering, you placed it among thousands of others, and you made your need visible to the divine world in a form the divine world could not ignore. The anatomical votives are among the most haunting. A terracotta uterus, realistically modeled, placed at a sanctuary associated with a healing deity. This is a woman's prayer. Her name is lost. Her face is lost. But her fear, the fear of miscarriage, of infertility, of the dangers of childbirth in a world without modern medicine, is preserved in clay. The object is her voice, and it has been speaking for 2.5 millennia. Etruscan sanctuaries have yielded tens of thousands of such objects. Major deposit sites at Veii, Cerveteri, Tarquinia, Vulci, and many others have produced accumulations that speak to the intensity and continuity of religious practice across centuries. The sheer volume is extraordinary. At some sanctuaries, the votive deposits built up layer upon layer over generations, forming archaeological strata of devotion. The accumulated spiritual weight of communities seeking divine intervention in the intimate crises of human existence. And yet the Etruscans themselves, the voices behind the votives, remain elusive. Their language is partially understood, enough to read names and some ritual formulas, but the surviving literary tradition is essentially nil. What the Etruscans thought, what they believed about the afterlife, what their theology was, we know in outline from archaeological evidence and from Roman descriptions, which are inevitably filtered through a Roman perspective. The great Etruscan religious texts, the Libri Haruspicini and the Libri Fulgurales, the books of divination and celestial signs, are known only from Roman descriptions of a tradition that was already being treated, by the 1st century BCE, as an ancient and almost foreign body of knowledge. The Haruspex, the Etruscan specialist in reading the entrails of sacrificed animals, particularly the liver, is one of the most iconic figures in ancient religious practice. And the votive livers found at Etruscan sites, cast in bronze, modeled in clay, inscribed with the names of deities assigned to specific regions of the organ's surface. These are essentially three-dimensional maps of the divine world, the cosmos compressed into the body of a sacrificial animal, read by trained specialists whose knowledge was ancient and encoded and not entirely shared. What did they see in the liver? What did the diviner read in those folded surfaces, those variations of color and texture that told him something about the will of the gods, the fate of the city, the outcome of the battle? The knowledge is gone. The tradition was absorbed and eventually abandoned as Rome became Christian. The last Haruspex probably lived in late antiquity, carrying a tradition stretching back 1,000 years, and when he died, the reading stopped. But the votives remain, thousands of small clay hands and eyes and anatomical organs in the storage rooms of Italian museums, in archaeological deposits still being excavated, each one a moment of human need, preserved in fired earth, each one a prayer that never received an answer, or perhaps received one, in a world that knew how to listen in ways we have forgotten. What gods did those prayers reach? And what, in the silence of the sanctuary, did the Etruscans hear in return? There is a city on the edge of the western desert, a place where the living world meets the world of the dead with unusual directness, where the Nile's life-giving silt gives way to the pale immensity of the Sahara, in a boundary that the ancient Egyptians understood as a boundary between states of being. Abydos, one of the oldest cities in the world, a place of such primordial religious importance that the earliest pharaohs came here to be buried, and every subsequent dynasty came to pay homage to that first authority, that original sacred ground. And in Abydos there stands a temple that takes your breath away, not through scale alone, though its scale is considerable, but through quality, the quality of its carving, the quality of its color, the quality of the visual world it creates. The temple of Seti I, built by the pharaoh who ruled Egypt from approximately 1290 to 1279 BCE, is among the most beautifully decorated religious structures ever created by human hands. Seti I, Menmatre Seti I, came to the throne as the second pharaoh of the 19th dynasty, following the short and turbulent reign of his father Rameses I. He inherited an Egypt that was wealthy, powerful, and in need of a strong hand, and he proved to be exactly the ruler that moment required. He campaigned in the Levant, pushed back the Hittites, restored Egyptian prestige in the region. But his legacy is not military. His legacy is here, in the stone and paint of Abydos. Walk through the entrance of the temple, and the light changes. The exterior heat and brightness of the Egyptian day gives way to something cooler, dimmer, charged with a different quality of attention. The columns are massive, their surfaces carved in sunk relief, a technique particularly favored by Seti's artisans, in which the image is carved into the surface of the stone rather than raised from it, creating shadows that in strong light give the figures an almost three-dimensional intensity. The gods move across every surface: Osiris, Isis, Horus, Amun, Rahurakti, Ptah, Anubis, the full assembly of the Egyptian divine world, rendered with a precision and artistry that is, even now, 3,000 years later, simply astonishing. The color. If you have seen only the sun-bleached exterior of Egyptian monuments, the interior of Seti's temple will restructure your understanding of what this civilization was. The original pigments, ochre and Egyptian blue and malachite green, and the deep red of iron oxide, survive in many chambers in a state of preservation that seems almost impossible. The figures do not look ancient, they look present. The blue of Amun's skin, the gold of the sun disk, the white linen of the priests. In the light that filters through the doorways, you feel for a moment as though you have stepped backward in time, as though the ceremony that this space was built to house has simply paused rather than ended. The temple is unusual in its plan. Where most Egyptian temples were dedicated to a single deity, Seti's Abydos temple contains 7 parallel sanctuaries, each dedicated to a different god, with an 8th dedicated to the deified Seti himself. This arrangement, unprecedented in Egyptian religious architecture, reflects the particular theological ambitions of this building. It was not merely a temple. It was a statement about the structure of the cosmos, about the relationships between the divine powers, about the place of the pharaoh within the sacred order. And behind the main temple structure lies something that has attracted more controversy than almost any monument in Egypt. The Osirian, a mysterious, half-subterranean structure that Seti I began and his son Rameses II completed, a building whose design is radically different from the temple itself, constructed of massive granite blocks in a style that some Egyptologists describe as deliberately archaic, evoking the earliest Egyptian sacred architecture. It was designed as a cenotaph of Osiris, a symbolic tomb for the god of the dead, a place where the myth of death and resurrection could be enacted in stone and water. The Osirian is built at a lower level than the surrounding structures, and in antiquity was almost certainly filled with groundwater, making the central island on which the symbolic sarcophagus stood a literal island surrounded by the primordial waters of Nun, the chaos from which creation had emerged. You descend into the Osirian today through a long corridor, the light dimming around you, and the air changes, cooler, heavier, carrying the faint scent of damp stone. The scale of the individual blocks is extraordinary, out of all proportion to what would be strictly necessary for a symbolic structure. They are the blocks of a civilization that measured its relationship to eternity in tons. The famous Abydos King List, preserved in another part of the temple complex, records the names of 76 pharaohs from Menes, the legendary first king, to Seti I himself, a continuous chain of legitimacy linking this 19th dynasty ruler to the very origin of Egyptian civilization. But the list has gaps, deliberate omissions: Hatshepsut, Akhenaten, the Amarna pharaohs, rulers whose reigns were being officially erased from history even as this list was being carved. History is not only what is recorded, it is also what is left out. And Seti I, in the magnificence of his temple at Abydos, was writing a version of history, beautiful, selective, deliberately arranged. The gods stare down from the walls with their serene expressions, indifferent to the editorial decisions being made below them. What else was edited? What other truths lie beneath the magnificent surface of these painted walls, waiting to be found in the unlit corridors of what has not yet been excavated? In the flatlands of what is now the Khuzestan province of southwestern Iran, on a plain that seems in summer to shimmer with a heat that erases the boundary between earth and sky, there rises a structure so ancient, so massive, so complete in its original ambition, that it seems to belong not to the archaeological record, but to something older, to the category of things that simply are, that have always been, that defy the ordinary logic of human construction and decay. Chogha Zanbil, the great ziggurat, the mountain that men built. It was constructed around 1250 BCE, during the height of the Elamite civilization, a civilization that had flourished in this region for millennia, contemporary with the great cities of Mesopotamia, trading with them, warring with them, absorbing influences while maintaining its own distinctive culture, its own language, its own sacred geography. The Elamites are not well known in the popular imagination. They are overshadowed, as so many ancient Near Eastern peoples are, by the more heavily documented civilizations of Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, and Assyria. But the Elamites were there, present, powerful, creative, through the entire span of ancient Near Eastern history. And Chogha Zanbil is their greatest surviving monument. The king who built it was Untash-Napirisha, a ruler of the Middle Elamite period whose name echoes with the compound structure of Elamite theology. embedding within itself the names of two great gods. He built not merely a ziggurat, but an entire sacred city, a complex of temples, chapels, and processional ways surrounding the central stepped tower, all enclosed within a series of concentric walls, the outermost of which extended for nearly 4 kilometers. This was not a building. This was a world built for the gods. The ziggurat itself originally rose to 5 stories, though only 3 survive today with any integrity, the upper stages having collapsed over the centuries into the rubble and debris that any structure left unattended for 3,000 years will accumulate. But even in its diminished state, the scale is overwhelming. The base extends approximately 100 meters on each side. The surviving structure rises to a height of about 25 meters. Imagine a 10-story building, built entirely of mud brick, decorated with glazed ceramic elements in deep blue and green, surmounted originally by a temple to the gods for whom all of this was constructed. The principal deity here was Inshushinak, the god of the dead, the lord of the underworld, the divine power most closely associated with the sacred city of Susa, the great Elamite capital not far to the west. But the complex at Chogha Zanbil incorporated temples to many other Elamite gods as well: Napiresha, Kiririsha, Shemut, a theological gathering that reflected the ambition of a ruler who wished to bring all the divine powers of his civilization into a single sacred space. The construction technique tells its own story. The bricks are inscribed. Walk close to the surviving surfaces, and you can still read the marks, cuneiform inscriptions baked directly into the bricks, recording the name of Untash Napirisha and his dedication of this structure to Inshushinak. There are thousands of these bricks, tens of thousands, each one carrying the king's name into eternity, multiplied across the surface of a monument designed to make that multiplication permanent. A prayer, written in industrial quantities. A king's name encoded into the very substance of his civilization's greatest work. The vaulted tombs discovered beneath and around the ziggurat complex add another layer to the mystery. These are remarkable structures, underground burial chambers with sophisticated vaulting techniques, containing evidence of extraordinarily elaborate funerary practices. Burned human remains, offerings of extraordinary value, evidence of ritual fires that consumed the grave goods as part of an interment ceremony. Who was buried here? What was the relationship between the tomb occupants and the sacred complex above? The Elamite afterlife belief system remains only partially understood. We have fragments, references, archaeological evidence, but the complete theological picture remains out of reach. The site was violently destroyed around 640 BCE by the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, who sacked the Elamite cities in a campaign recorded in triumphant Assyrian annals. The destruction was total and deliberate, a civilization deliberately unmade. Chogha Zanbil survived only because it had already been abandoned at the time of the assault. The sacred city never fully completed after Untash Napirisha's death, left to the slow dissolution of wind and rain and time. Stand at the base of the surviving stages and look upward along the angled walls of mud brick. The material is humble: mud, water, the labor of human hands pressing clay into molds, stacking and bonding, and building upward toward a sky that the Elamites understood as the home of divine power. And yet, what has been made from this humble material is not humble at all. It is a mountain, a manufactured mountain, rising from the flatlands with a conviction that the cosmos required this shape, this presence, this physical assertion of the connection between earth and heaven, after the destruction, after the abandonment, after 3,000 years of wind and silence, it is still here, still rising, still refusing to submit entirely to the plane. What compact was made in those underground tombs beneath the eternal weight of all those inscribed bricks? What promise was sealed between the living and the dead, between the king and his gods, in the vaulted chambers below the mountain that men built? The cuneiform bricks carry the name. They do not carry the answer. There's a type of knowledge that only catastrophe can give. In 79 CE, Mount Vesuvius erupted and preserved Pompeii, not as a ruin, but as a frozen moment. The world of a Roman city, at the instant of its end, sealed in volcanic ash, available to the archaeologist with an intimacy that no intact, continuously occupied settlement could ever provide. The catastrophe became the archive, and in El Salvador, in the Zapotecan Valley, sometime around 600 CE, a similar catastrophe, a volcanic eruption from the nearby Loma Caldera, preserved something equally extraordinary. Not a Roman city of marble and mosaic, something different, something perhaps more valuable in its own way. Joya de Cerén, the jewel of the valley, the village that the volcano swallowed and the centuries kept. What lies beneath the ash at Joya de Cerén is a Maya farming village, not the great city, not the temple complex, not the royal court or the astronomical observatory, just a village, small, ordinary, unremarkable by the standards of Maya archaeology, which has always been drawn to the spectacular and the elite. But ordinary is exactly what makes it extraordinary. Here, preserved under several meters of volcanic tephra, is the daily life of common people, the people who grew the corn, tended the beans, prepared the food, slept in their homes, stored their tools, and went about the business of human existence that history so rarely deems worth preserving. Walk, in your imagination, through the excavated structures. The houses are small, built of adobe and organic materials, the thatch of the roofs preserved as ghost impressions in the ash, the posts of the walls leaving their marks in the hardened earth. The floors are swept clean, as they were swept the day before the eruption, maintained with the domestic order of people who took pride in their homes. In one structure, the kitchen, ceramic pots still sitting in position, food still inside them, corn and beans and chili in the last meal that was being prepared when the volcano interrupted everything. The gardens. This is perhaps the most remarkable discovery of all. The garden plots around the houses are preserved with such precision that the furrows of planting, the individual maguey plants, the corn stalks and their spacing, all of it is legible in the ash. Agricultural science, cosmological in its implications. These were people who understood soil, who managed their environment with sophisticated knowledge, who had developed over generations a system of cultivation precisely adapted to this valley's climate and topography. That knowledge, like the people who held it, was buried, and now it speaks again. Personal objects appear with the intimacy of interrupted life. A metate, the stone grinding platform for processing corn, still holds the handstone at the angle it was sitting when the ash fell. Ceramic vessels are set out as though waiting for use. A gourd sits where it was placed. A sleeping mat preserves its impression. The human bodies, unlike Pompeii, have largely not survived. The villagers had time to flee before the ash became fatal, a brief and terrible window of warning that allowed most of them to escape the immediate death that overtook Pompeii's residents. But in their escape, they left their things behind, and their things are the record of a human world that would otherwise be invisible. What the eruption of Loma Caldera captured was not the Maya of the texts and the inscriptions, not the long count calendar, not the astronomical codices, not the king lists and the battle narratives. It captured the Maya that the texts never mention: the woman grinding corn in the morning, the farmer checking his garden, the child who left a handprint in the wet adobe of a wall being plastered. The 90% of Maya civilization that lived, worked, ate, and died without ever being important enough for the scribes to notice. This is what catastrophe can give: the recovery of the invisible. But questions accumulate, as they always do. The ritual spaces at Joya de Cerén, and there are ritual spaces suggesting that even in this small village, the sacred life was present and organized, have yielded objects whose function remains debated. Ceramic figures, bundles of possible ritual materials, arrangements that suggest practices whose meaning we cannot fully reconstruct from the physical evidence alone. The religion of the village is not the religion of the great Maya centers, not the formal cosmological system of the court. It is something local, something intimate, something that grew from this soil and these families and their generations of relationship with this particular valley. What did the villagers pray for in their small ritual spaces at the foot of the volcano that would one day bury their prayers? What bargains were made? What offerings left? What words spoken to the gods of the valley in the dark before the harvest? The ash preserved the pot, but not the prayer; the furrow, but not the farmer's hope; the gourd, but not the voice that sang over the grinding stone in the early morning, before the volcano woke and the world changed, and the jewel of the valley was sealed away for 14 centuries, waiting to be found. There is a city beneath a desert that was once not a desert, a city that flourished in a period when the rivers ran differently, when the monsoon fell with a generosity that the modern climate of this region has long since abandoned, when the Rann of Kutch, today a vast white salt flat in the Indian state of Gujarat, was something other than what it is now, something wetter, something shifting, something seasonally alive, something livable, something that could support a city of sophistication and ambition, and perhaps grandeur, built with intent rather than chance. Dholavira, one of the 5 largest cities of the Indus Valley civilization, a civilization that may be the most underappreciated major ancient urban culture in the world, and one of the least fully understood despite its scale. Consider what the Indus Valley civilization was, and then consider how little most people know about it. At its height, around 2500 to 2000 BCE, it encompassed an area larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined, stretching across vast river systems and plains. It included dozens of major urban centers: Mohenjo-Daro, Harappa, Rakhigarhi, Ganeriwala, and Dholavira among them, cities laid out with a regularity and a concern for sanitation and water management that was not matched in the Western world until the Roman Empire, more than 2,000 years later, and even then only in part. It had trade connections stretching to Mesopotamia and Central Asia, networks of exchange that carried goods, ideas, and materials across great distances. It had a script, over 400 distinct signs identified, that has never been deciphered, never convincingly read, never unlocked despite decades of study. Never been deciphered. Sit with that for a moment and let the silence of it settle. We have thousands of Indus Valley Seal inscriptions, incised in fired steatite, depicting animals and abstract signs and possible ritual scenes, repeated patterns that suggest meaning but refuse certainty, and we cannot read a single word of them. The entire written record of one of the world's great ancient civilizations is a closed book, present before us yet inaccessible, speaking without sound. Dholavira adds particular dimensions to this mystery. The site was occupied from roughly 2650 to 2100 BCE, and its urban layout represents one of the most sophisticated city planning achievements of the ancient world, measured not only in scale but in precision. The city was divided into distinct zones: a citadel, a middle town, and a lower town, separated by massive walls and gateways built of carefully cut stone, arranged with deliberate geometry. Unlike many Indus cities, which used primarily mud brick, Dholavira made extensive use of dressed stone, giving its ruins a quality of permanence and grandeur that distinguishes it from its sister sites and makes it feel almost carved into the landscape itself. But what truly sets Dholavira apart is water. The city was an engineering marvel of hydraulic sophistication, almost counterintuitive in such an environment. Built on an island in the Rhine, it faced periodic water scarcity that its planners addressed with a system of reservoirs, dams, and channels that represents, in the considered opinion of many scholars, the most advanced water management system of the ancient world. 16 major reservoirs have been identified, connected by a network of channels that could capture, store, and distribute rainwater with extraordinary efficiency and foresight. The citizens of Dholavira did not merely survive their arid environment. They mastered it. They shaped it. They built, essentially, a water city in the middle of a desert that was not yet fully a desert. Stand in the excavated space of one of these reservoirs, a stepped enclosure of dressed stone, large enough to hold a significant volume of water, the steps descending to the original water line with the geometric precision of an engineering mind. And you feel the intelligence of the people who built it. Not mystery alone, intelligence, practical, applied, sophisticated intelligence of a very high order, expressed in stone, proportion, and control over scarcity. And then there is the signboard, the most enigmatic single artifact at Dholavira is a large inscription, the largest known Indus Valley inscription, found in what appears to have been a major gateway. Large white gypsum letters, perhaps affixed to a wooden board, spelled out a message in 10 signs, each carefully placed and visibly intentional. Whatever it says, a name, a proclamation, a declaration of authority, a divine invocation. It was large enough to be read from a distance, suggesting a public message, something intended for the eyes of everyone who passed through that gate. Not hidden knowledge, but displayed communication. A civilization with public writing, with the concept of official signage, with the assumption that a written message could be displayed and read and recognized. We cannot read it. The collapse of Dholavira, somewhere around 1800 BCE, mirrors the broader collapse of the Indus Valley civilization, a process that took centuries and whose causes remain vigorously debated without final resolution. Climate change, shifting river courses, the drying of the Saraswati river system, which may have been the hydraulic backbone of the entire civilization, epidemic disease, invasion, internal social transformation or breakdown. Some combination of all of these, interacting across time in ways that are still being reconstructed. The city was abandoned. The great water management system fell into disuse. The desert returned, slowly but completely, reclaiming what had been carefully organized against it. What was said on that gateway sign? What words did the people of Dholavira inscribe in white stone, for all who pass to see, repeated daily in light and shadow? It is possible, just barely possible, that the answer exists somewhere in those 400 undeciphered signs, waiting for the mind that will finally crack the code, or for a key that has not yet been imagined. Until then, the sign stands in its silence over the white salt flat of a world transformed, carrying a message that the ancient world considered important enough to display prominently, and that we are still not able to hear, or perhaps not yet able to understand. The south coast of Crete, a small sandy bay, horseshoe-shaped, enclosed by cliffs of golden sandstone that rise on either side of the beach with the abrupt drama of a theater backdrop, as if the landscape itself had been arranged for observation. The water is the blue of a myth. The light falls with the particular Mediterranean quality that makes the ancient world seem, sometimes, genuinely close, as though time here is thinner, as though the centuries press less heavily between the present moment and the distant past, and as though what is gone is still only just out of sight. And in those cliffs, carved into the soft sandstone by hands that moved across many centuries and many different human needs, returning again and again to the same porous stone, are the caves of Matala. They watch the bay like empty eyes. Dozens of them, tiered in irregular rows across the cliff faces, connected in some places by carved steps and ledges, each cave slightly different from the others in size and shape, and the evidence of what it was used for. Some are small and simple, barely more than a shallow niche. Others are larger, with carved stone benches along the walls, niches cut above as though to receive objects of daily use or ritual significance, stone pillows shaped for a particular resting posture, or perhaps for the stillness of death. The craft here is not spectacular, but it is attentive, repetitive, persistent. Whoever carved these caves was making a home, or a tomb, or something in between, whose definition shifts depending on who is looking. The earliest use of the Matala Caves is generally attributed to the Neolithic period. Humans were shaping and using these sandstone hollows perhaps as early as 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, returning to the same sheltering geometry offered by the cliff. But the caves are perhaps most associated with the Roman period, when they were used, or so tradition holds, as tombs. Niches in the walls align with the postures of the dead laid to rest in them, as if the stone had been arranged to accommodate absence. The spatial organization, the progression from entrance to deeper interior, follows patterns familiar from rock-cut tomb traditions throughout the ancient Mediterranean, where architecture becomes a controlled descent into stillness. Here were placed the Cretan dead of the Roman period, their remains surrounded by the slow work of the Mediterranean climate, by dust and wind and the sound of waves that the living still hear today, unchanged in rhythm. And then, centuries later, the caves had a second life that no archaeologist anticipated, and that history books rarely mention except in passing. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, the caves of Matala became a famous counterculture destination, inhabited by young travelers from across the Western world who found in these ancient hollows a romantically ramshackle shelter against modern certainty. The caves became temporary homes for a generation of wanderers, their sandstone walls decorated with new art, their ancient silences filled with music, conversation, and the smell of cooking fires. The same recesses that once held the dead now held the living, loosely, briefly, as though the stone itself made little distinction between the two. Joni Mitchell is said to have written the song Carrie about her time in Matala. The caves that had sheltered the prehistoric and the Roman dead now sheltered the living youth of a different civilization, seeking escape from their own world's structures and expectations. This layering, prehistoric human activity, Neolithic habitation, Roman use as tombs, Byzantine-era hermit occupation in later centuries, and then the 20th century counterculture, makes Matala one of the most genuinely palimpsestic human spaces in the Mediterranean, where each layer remains faintly visible beneath the next. Every era found in these caves something it needed: protection, burial, isolation, freedom. Every era left its marks, sometimes carved, sometimes merely lived. And the caves, patient and softly glowing in the Mediterranean light, received all comers with the same sandstone indifference, eroding slowly, but not choosing. The Minoan presence in and around Matala is another thread in the uncertainty. The broader Mesara Plain, on which Matala sits at the southern edge, is Minoan country. The great palace of Phaistos lies not far inland, and the area was densely settled and richly agricultural during the height of Minoan civilization in the Bronze Age. Whether the caves were used during the Minoan period for habitation, for ritual, for burial, or not at all, remains a question that the surviving evidence has not definitively answered. Minoan funerary practices were varied and complex, including rock-cut tombs in other parts of Crete, and the caves of Matala, with their natural suitability for such purposes, may well have served the living and the dead of that world too, even if the traces are now faint or indistinguishable from later use. Imagine walking across the beach at Matala before dawn, before the tourists arrive, before the small cafes open, before the 21st century reasserts itself in sound and schedule. In the gray pre-dawn light, the caves above you are dark apertures in a pale cliff, stacked like unanswered questions. The sea makes its sound steady and indifferent, and you feel, not as interpretation but as immediate impression, that the human story of this place extends so far back into the past that the distinction between Neolithic, Bronze Age, Roman, Byzantine, Hippie, and the present moment becomes somewhat arbitrary, as if all of them are simply different instants of occupation along the same shoreline. People came here. They found shelter. They carved their presence into the soft golden stone. They lived and died and moved on, and the caves remained holding only shape and shadow. What did the dead see from these niches across the long dark of their interment, with the sound of the sea entering every dream and never leaving? What did the living see from the same openings, the same bay, the same blue, the same horizon repeating itself through different centuries, and feel? The same awe, perhaps, the same smallness, the same stubborn, unreasonable hope that the world outside the cave would remain, even as everything inside it changed. There is a bend in the Arkansas River in what is now eastern Oklahoma, a landscape of rolling hills and rich bottomland that, in the period archaeologists call the Caddoan Mississippian culture, supported a political and ceremonial center of extraordinary power and reach, tied into exchange systems that stretched far beyond what the eye can easily register on the ground. You would not necessarily guess this now, standing in the quiet of the Spiro Mounds Archaeological Park, watching the brown river move through the flatlands with its slow, opaque current. The mounds appear gentle, unassuming, their original height reduced by centuries of erosion, and, more devastatingly, by human intervention that reshaped them long after their builders were gone. But beneath those grass-covered earthworks, and in the material that was extracted from them, often catastrophically and without regard for context, lay one of the most extraordinary concentrations of pre-Columbian ceremonial objects ever discovered in North America, a concentration that still defines how this site is discussed in archaeological literature. Spiro, the name belongs to the nearby town, a later settling, a later naming that simply attached itself to something much older. The people who built these mounds did not, as far as we know, use this name for their center. They may have had no name for it at all, in the sense we would recognize, or their name is lost in the silence that swallowed most of the oral traditions of the Mississippian world when those traditions were interrupted. What we call them is a placeholder, a convenience of modern language. What they called themselves was something else entirely, now unreachable except through fragments. At its height, roughly between 900 and 1450 CE, Spiro was a major node in the enormous exchange network scholars call the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex, sometimes called the Southern Cult, a web of shared iconography, ritual practices, and high-value object exchange that connected Mississippian centers from the Gulf Coast to the Great Lakes, from the Atlantic Piedmont to the plains of the interior, forming a vast cultural horizon rather than a single unified state. Copper, engraved shell, embossed ceramics, the stylized images of the falcon warrior, the weeping eye, the bilobed arrow, the rattlesnake, a shared visual language of sacred power that crossed linguistic and political boundaries with the fluency of a truly pan-continental religious tradition, repeated and reinterpreted across distance. At Spiro, the ceremonial complex included 12 mounds arranged in a deliberate spatial organization that still hints at planning principles we can partially reconstruct. The largest, Craig Mound, was not a platform for an elite structure, but something more unusual, a mortuary mound, constructed in stages over centuries, each stage sealing the previous one, building up a layered archive of the most significant dead of this community and their accompanying ritual objects, as if memory itself were being physically accumulated. The innermost chamber of Craig Mound, when it was finally encountered, contained objects of incomparable beauty and importance: effigy pipes of carved stone, engraved shell gorgets of breathtaking precision, copper plates embossed with the imagery of the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex, embroidered textiles that had largely decayed but left ghost impressions of extraordinary complexity, still legible in outline if not in full material presence. But Craig Mound was not discovered by archaeologists. It was looted. In 1933, during the economic desperation of the Great Depression, a group of local entrepreneurs obtained a lease to excavate Craig Mound, forming the Pocola Mining Company, with the explicit intention of selling whatever they found on a commercial market. What followed was an act of archaeological devastation, almost unparalleled in the Americas, not only in what was removed, but in what was irreversibly erased. The miners dug through the mound with commercial efficiency, destroying stratigraphy and context as they went, selling objects on the antiquities market, trading them to collectors and museums across the country, melting some copper objects down for the raw metal value they contained. The interior chamber, the great mortuary, as archaeologists now call it, was looted of the majority of its contents before professional archaeologists could intervene in any meaningful way. What was lost is incalculable. The objects themselves many of them now scattered across museum collections and private holdings across the country, represent only the material that survived and was preserved through chance rather than intention. The contexts, the spatial relationships between objects, the positions of the dead, the stratigraphic evidence of the multiple building phases, the evidence of how the chamber was constructed and sealed and reopened over generations, is almost entirely gone, destroyed by the picks and shovels of men who needed money in the worst years of the American 20th century, and who could not have known the full weight of what they were dismantling. The objects that survive are magnificent. The engraved shell cups and gorgets, carved with images of figures engaged in cosmological narratives, the Birdman, the Morning Star ceremony, figures in elaborate regalia that suggest priestly or chiefly roles in a complex ritual world, are among the masterpieces of North American indigenous art, remarkable not only for their detail, but for their conceptual ambition. The stone effigy pipes depict humans, animals, and composite beings with a naturalism and attention to proportion that speaks of a tradition of accomplished carvers working within a rich and demanding aesthetic and symbolic system. Who were the figures depicted on these objects? What ceremony do these engraved scenes record in their compressed visual grammar? The iconography connects to what we know of later southeastern indigenous ceremonial life, but the specific meanings of these specific objects, in this specific context, at this specific place, that knowledge belongs to traditions that were catastrophically disrupted by colonization, and whose reconstruction is an ongoing collaborative project between archaeologists and the descendant communities who carry in different forms different fragments of the memory of this world. What was buried in Craig Mound was not just objects, it was a theology, a political history, a record of relationships between the living and the dead, between this community and the vast network of sacred exchange that connected it to a continent, and perhaps to a cosmology as well. That record was shattered in 1933 and scattered to the four winds, dispersed into institutions and private collections, and gaps in the archaeological record. What remains speaks eloquently of what was, but only in partial sentences. The mounds still stand, the river still bends, and the questions about what was known here, what was believed, what was exchanged and buried and honored, still hang in the Oklahoma air, waiting for answers that the soil can no longer give in full, only in fragments and traces, and the faint outline of what once was whole. The Burren. Even the name is a kind of landscape in the mouth. The Irish Boiran, meaning great rock, and truly this is a place defined by rock, not as backdrop, but as substance. The limestone karst of County Clare in the west of Ireland is one of the most extraordinary landscapes in Europe. A vast, pale, fractured pavement of carboniferous limestone, cracked by millennia of freeze and thaw into a geometric puzzle of clints and grikes, the fissures hosting rare plants that grow nowhere else, the whole expanse stretching toward the Atlantic under skies that change with a speed and drama that feels almost theatrical, as if weather itself is performing over stone. And in this world of gray rock and gray sky, scattered across the Burren with a density that speaks of a long and deeply populated past, are the cashels, the stone forts, circular enclosures of dry stone walling built by the early medieval Irish population, some dating back to the Iron Age and earlier phases of settlement, some built and occupied through the early medieval period and beyond, reused and adapted as generations changed. Caherconnell is among the best preserved and most extensively studied of these structures, a rare case where survival and excavation together allow partial reconstruction of a vanished way of life. You approach it across the limestone pavement, and it appears as it must have appeared to everyone who has ever approached it since it was built. A massive circular wall, 3 to 4 meters thick, rising to a height of several meters, enclosing a space large enough to have housed a significant family group or small community, along with their animals, all within the same boundary of stone. The dry stone construction is masterful, each stone selected and placed without mortar, the whole structure held together entirely by gravity, friction, and the accumulated skill of the builder's eye. After more than 1,000 years, the wall stands. It does not merely survive. In many sections, it is simply intact, requiring no imagination to reconstruct its original intent. Step inside, and the quality of the interior changes immediately. The wind, which comes off the Atlantic with a persistence that feels personal out on the open karst, is cut by the massive walls. The acoustic quality of the space shifts as well, as sound rebounds differently within the circular enclosure. There is a reason humans build circles. The circle creates a center, an inside, a definition of here versus there, us versus the exposure of the open landscape beyond. Inside the cashel, you are sheltered not just physically, but psychologically. The wall is a statement of belonging, of habitation, of continuity, of the transformation of raw landscape into bounded human space. Caherconnell was occupied from approximately the 5th century CE into the medieval period, perhaps continuously, perhaps with interruptions, the archaeological evidence suggesting multiple phases of use, repair, and modification that are still being disentangled. The site is associated with the broader world of early medieval Irish society, a stratified cattle-based economy in which the cashel was both a domestic space and a statement of status, embedded in a landscape of small-scale polities and shifting alliances. The thickness of the walls at Caherconnell suggests a defensive function, and the wider landscape of the Burren during this period was one of competing territorial claims, cattle raids, and the complex honor-based social system described in early Irish law traditions. Those law texts, the great corpus of Brehon law, codified in the 7th and 8th centuries from older oral tradition, give us a partial but remarkable window into the society that built places like Caherconnell. The cashel owner was a man of some standing, a boer, a free farmer with cattle and land and legal rights, or perhaps a chieftain of greater status whose wealth was counted in livestock, obligations, and honor rather than coin. The cattle themselves would have sheltered inside the cashel at night, or in times of danger, the community and its animals sharing the enclosed space in the intimate, interdependent way characteristic of pre-industrial rural life, where survival and social order overlapped in the same physical enclosure. The Burren cashels cluster in patterns that suggest a densely settled and carefully managed landscape, not the empty, romantic wilderness of later imagination, but a lived-in, populated, contested, and continuously worked world where the limestone pavement was navigated with knowledge that was local, specific, and transmitted across generations. The grikes of the karst preserve in microclimatic shelter, the remnants of woodland plants and wildflowers that are all that survive of a more extensive vegetation system that once covered more of the region. The Burren was not always so bare. Human activity, clearing, burning, grazing, and long-term pastoral management has shaped its appearance over many centuries. The people of Caherconnell knew this landscape in ways that are now difficult to recover, except indirectly. They knew which clints were reliable footing under wet stone, which grikes were deep enough to lose a sheep or conceal a trap, which hollows held water after rain, which exposures offered shelter from the westerly Atlantic gales that sweep in without warning. This knowledge was survival knowledge, but also cultural knowledge, embedded in place names, in oral traditions that named and narrated every feature of the landscape, in the accumulated practical intelligence of families who had lived in this specific place across many generations, adjusting slowly to change while maintaining continuity. That accumulated wisdom was disrupted repeatedly over time, by the Norman conquest of Ireland, by later English plantations, by the demographic and social catastrophe of the Great Famine of the 19th century that emptied vast tracts of the Irish countryside and broke many local continuities. The oral traditions that once gave meaning to these stones and this landscape survive only in fragments, filtered through later records or preserved in altered form. The cashel stands, but the full story of who built it, who lived in it, what was said and sung and argued and resolved within these walls, that story has thinned, frayed, and in many parts disappeared entirely. The dry stone walls of Caherconnell will stand for centuries more, held by the same gravity that has always held them. The Atlantic wind still does what the Atlantic wind has always done, without regard for human settlement. And the question of what it was like to be fully human in this limestone world, to know its names and its stories, and its sacred and practical places, in the way that the people who built this fort once knew them, remains a question that the silence of the Burren answers only indirectly, in the language of stone, wind, grass, and the long endurance of forms that outlast memory. In the mountains of ancient Gandhara, the region that sprawls across what is now northwestern Pakistan and eastern Afghanistan, through valleys that connect the Indian subcontinent to Central Asia and beyond, there are the remnants of a world where Buddhism and Hellenism and Persian and Indian traditions met in one of the most extraordinary cultural syntheses in human history, shaped by trade routes, imperial crossings, and the slow movement of ideas across high passes. This was the land where Greek-speaking kings patronized Buddhist monasteries, where artisans adapted foreign techniques into local sacred forms, and where the first widely known images of the Buddha in human form were carved. A revolution in religious art that would ripple outward to define Buddhist visual culture across the entire expanse of Asia, changing how the sacred itself could be seen. And here, in this charged cultural landscape, stands the Topdara Stupa. It sits in the Charsada district region of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province, in a landscape that has seen so much history, so much violence, so much transformation that the presence of ancient monuments here is simultaneously precious and precarious, as if survival itself has become an intermittent condition. The stupa, the hemispherical mound form that is the most universal architectural expression of Buddhist sacred presence, rises from its base with the quiet authority of a form that has been carrying spiritual meaning for more than 2,000 years, repeated across regions but always anchored in place. The stupa's origin lies in the burial mounds of ancient India, the earthen tumuli that covered the remains of honored dead, the physical accumulation of earth and stone as a marker of sacred presence and memory made material. When Buddhism emerged and the Buddha himself died, his remains, the sacred relics, were divided among the early Buddhist communities and enshrined in stupas that became centers of veneration, pilgrimage, and merit-making practice. The stupa was not merely a tomb, it was a presence, the Buddha's continuing presence in the world. His spiritual power made architecturally accessible to the faithful, who circumambulated its base, who made offerings at its base, who touched its stones with palms pressed together in repeated gesture. The Topdara Stupa is a Gandharan monument, belonging to the broader cultural sphere of Gandhara, roughly the 1st century BCE through the 5th century CE, in which the region produced some of the most remarkable Buddhist art and architecture ever created. The Gandharan school of sculpture combined the technical achievements of Hellenistic art, naturalistic drapery, idealized human anatomy, spatial depth, and narrative relief, with the iconographic requirements of Buddhist tradition, creating images of the Buddha and Bodhisattvas that are simultaneously shaped by multiple visual heritages and yet directed toward a single devotional purpose. The stupa's drum and dome are constructed of stone, kanjur, the local schist that Gandharan builders used with such mastery and consistency, and the surface was originally richly decorated with carved relief panels depicting scenes from the Buddha's life and the lives of the bodhisattvas, arranged in narrative sequences that guided the viewer's attention around the structure. Many of these panels, like the carved decorations of so many Gandharan sites, are now scattered across museum collections worldwide. The British Museum, the Lahore Museum, the Peshawar Museum, and institutions in Europe and beyond, separated from their architectural context, where meaning once emerged from movement as much as from image. Walk around the surviving base of the Topdara Stupa, the Pradakshina, the circumambulatory path, and you are walking in a tradition that extends back 2 millennia, a ritual geometry that has remained remarkably stable across time. The act of walking clockwise around the stupa, maintaining the sacred structure on your right hand, is one of the oldest ritual gestures in Buddhism, a physical embodiment of the mind's orientation toward the Dharma, the teaching, the presence of the awakened one. Pilgrims have walked this path. Monks have walked this path. Kings, merchants, soldiers passing through frontier regions, ordinary farmers from surrounding valleys, all of them drawn to this hemispherical form and its promise of accumulated merit, accumulated clarity, accumulated peace, expressed not in words but in movement. The monastery that presumably accompanied the stupa, for stupas were almost never isolated, but were part of broader monastic complexes, centers of learning, debate, copying, and teaching, is now only partially traceable in the archaeology of the surrounding terrain, visible more in patterns and fragments than in standing architecture. The monks who lived here, who studied here, who copied texts and debated philosophy and taught the Dharma to the communities of the Peshawar Valley, they are invisible, their voices gone, their texts lost or scattered or transformed into later traditions elsewhere. What remains is the stone, the dome, the form that meant something so powerful that civilizations carried it across deserts and mountain ranges, from India to Central Asia, to China, to Korea, to Japan, everywhere adapting it, but preserving its essential logic. The dome, the axis, the sacred center, the circumambulatory path that organizes both body and attention. What relic lay at the heart of Topdara? What fragment of the sacred, a nail clipping, a hair, a fragment of bone, a personal belonging associated with reverence, was placed at the stupa's core when it was first constructed, transforming a mound of stone into a living sacred presence rather than a mere structure. The tradition says that every stupa enshrines something of the Buddha or of a great saint that concentrates their spiritual power in this specific place for the benefit of those who approach it with intention. Whether or not one accepts that theology, the intention behind it illuminates something profound about why human beings build monuments, the wish to make the sacred geographically specific, to anchor meaning in a location that can be returned to across generations, across uncertainty, across forgetting. The stupa stands. The mountains rise behind it, folded and distant. The valley spreads below, shaped by river systems and human settlement. And the question of what it felt like to approach this place with genuine faith, to believe, as the pilgrims believed, that the stone itself participated in something greater, that it radiated something of the awakened mind, remains a question that only lived experience can approximate, and that language can only circle, never fully contain, like movement around a center that is always both present and just beyond reach. On a rocky promontory in what is now the Diyarbakir province of southeastern Turkey, a military installation looks out over the plains of Upper Mesopotamia, with the commanding posture of a structure built by people who understood the strategic value of height, of visibility, of the ability to see what is coming from a long distance, and to hold a line between worlds that rarely settled into stability. Zerzevan Castle, Zarziathra in the ancient sources, occupies a natural elevated position that would have made it both a formidable defensive position and an important administrative and religious center in the complex frontier landscape of late antiquity, where borders were less lines than zones of continuous tension and passage. The Romans built here. Or rather, the Romans expanded and fortified what was already a significant site, constructing the walls and towers and internal structures that constitute the castle as we know it today, primarily in the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, when this region was the eastern frontier of the empire, the zone of constant tension, negotiation, and occasional violent conflict with the Roman Sasanian Wars and the wider Sasanian Empire to the east. The architecture here is not only military, it is administrative, logistical, and symbolic, projecting permanence into a landscape where political control was often temporary. But what makes Zerzevan extraordinary, what lifts it from the category of interesting Roman frontier fort to something genuinely arresting, is what has been found inside its walls in recent years. Excavations have revealed a Mithraeum of Zerzevan Castle, a temple of the mystery cult of Mithras that is one of the best preserved examples of this deeply enigmatic religious tradition found anywhere in the ancient world, preserved in a condition that allows unusual clarity of reconstruction. Mithraism. The name alone carries a particular resonance. The cult that bears his name, practiced primarily by soldiers and officials throughout the Roman military world from roughly the 1st to the 4th centuries CE, remains one of the most studied and most debated religious phenomena of the ancient world, precisely because it was a mystery cult in the full technical sense. Its central doctrines and rituals were revealed only to initiates, conducted in secret, and never written down in forms accessible to outsiders. The mysteries of Mithras were kept not as omission but as structure. What we have is archaeology. The Mithraea, the underground or semi-underground sanctuaries where the cult met, follow a consistent design across the Roman world. A long, cave-like room with benches along the sides where initiates reclined, and at the far end, a central image of the Tauroctony, the bull-slaying scene, in which Mithras, clad in a Phrygian cap and billowing cloak, plunges his knife into the neck of a bull while looking away, as a scorpion attacks the bull's genitals, and a dog and snake drink the flowing blood. Torchbearers flank the scene. A raven watches from above. The whole image is dense with symbolic structure that has been read through astronomical, ritual, and mythological frameworks, none of which exhaust it completely. The zerzevan Mithraeum contains this scene, its carved relief preserved with unusual completeness. But what distinguishes the zerzevan discovery is the remarkably intact state of the entire ritual space. The benches, the architectural elements, the spatial organization, which gives archaeologists an unusually coherent picture of what a functioning Mithraeum looked like when it was in use. It allows, at least in outline, a reconstruction of movement, of gathering, of how bodies occupied the space in relation to the image at its end. You can almost see the soldiers crowding in from their barracks after dark, the disciplined hierarchy of the Roman army momentarily reshaped into a different order, the torchlight illuminating the stone relief, the ritual of shared meal, wine, and recitation unfolding in the confined space below ground. The Roman military world was not only a machine of conquest, it was also a machine of integration, drawing meaning from shared repetition across distance and origin. The soldiers who worshipped here came from across the empire, from North Africa, from the Balkans, from Gaul, from Syria, carried into the same structures of discipline and belief. The Roman army was a mixing engine of extraordinary power, drawing men from every corner of an empire that stretched from Scotland to Mesopotamia, and binding them together with shared discipline, shared pay, shared danger, and, in many cases, shared religious experience that offered coherence within instability. Mithras was, in some sense, a soldier's god, demanding, martial, initiatory, promising cosmic alignment to those who could endure the trials of initiation and live within the discipline of the cult. What were those trials? The ancient sources are fragmentary, and later interpretations multiply rather than clarify. Ordeals of cold and heat, symbolic death and rebirth, structured progression through 7 grades of initiation that mapped both social hierarchy and cosmic symbolism. The highest grade was pater, father, and those who reached it presumably carried the full weight of the cult's theological framework, though the content of that knowledge remains unrecoverable in detail. When the Mithraic cult ended, in the 4th and 5th centuries, as Christianity became dominant in the Roman world, the patres took their knowledge with them. The structure dissolved, but the secrecy had already ensured its own survival into silence. Zerzevan also preserves evidence of a Mithric ritual water system, channels and cisterns associated with the Mithraeum that suggest water played a role in the cult's ceremonies, purification, symbolic transition, a controlled passage between states of being marked through elemental contact. The specifics remain elusive, as they were designed to remain, and archaeology can only describe the architecture of what is absent as much as what is present. The castle continued to function after the end of the Mithraic cult, reoccupied, refortified, serving the various powers that contested this critical frontier landscape through Byzantine, Arab, and later medieval periods. But it is the underground room, the carved relief, the benches where soldiers once sat in lamplight receiving mysteries. It is this that draws attention back, persistently, to the question of what was known here that is no longer known, and what kinds of knowledge are structured precisely to disappear when their social world ends. The bull still bleeds. Mithras still looks away. The torches have long been extinguished, and the secret of what was understood in their light remains exactly what it was designed to be, a mystery, preserved not in explanation, but in the shape of the space that once held it. There is a city in the heart of what is now North Macedonia, in the Ovce Pole Valley, where the Bregalnica River moves through agricultural land that has been farmed and settled since the Neolithic, that once held a position of extraordinary strategic importance in one of the most turbulent political landscapes of the ancient world, where control of passes and valleys meant control of movement itself. Bylazora. The ancient sources mention it. Philip V of Macedon considered it crucial enough to fight for. The city controlled the passage between the Aegean world and the interior Balkans, and whoever held it could substantially influence the movement of armies, goods, and political power across a vast and unstable frontier zone where geography and politics were inseparable. And for most of its history, Bylazora was Paeonian, a city of the Paeonians. The Paeonians. Here again, we encounter a people who exist at the margins of the classical canon, overshadowed by their more frequently documented neighbors, the Macedonians to the south, the Thracians to the east, the Illyrians to the west, yet repeatedly drawn into their conflicts and systems of exchange. The Paeonians occupied the upper Axios and Strymon river valleys, a people of settled agricultural communities and urban centers whose culture was substantially Thracian in character, but who maintained a distinct political and cultural identity through centuries of pressure from surrounding powers, shifting alliances, and repeated conquest. They are mentioned in Homeric tradition. They are said to have fought at Troy. They were conquered and reconquered by Macedon under Philip II, by the Persians under Darius, by various Hellenistic successor states, and yet they persisted, maintaining their presence in the archaeological record as a distinct cultural entity through the Hellenistic and into the Roman period, even as boundaries and identities shifted around them. Bylazora is, increasingly, recognized as one of the most important Paeonian sites known. Archaeological work at the site, commonly associated with the modern area near Sveti Nikola, though the exact identification is still discussed in scholarship, has revealed a city of substantial size, urban defenses, buildings of dressed stone, and evidence of metalworking and ceramic production that indicate organized craft specialization. Imported goods demonstrate connection to the broader Hellenistic commercial network, linking this valley to wider systems of exchange that extended across the Balkans and into the Mediterranean world. This was not a village. This was a city of regional significance, a center of Paeonian political and economic life, embedded in long-distance networks. The Hellenistic influence is palpable in the material culture. Greek pottery, Greek architectural elements. The coins, for Bylazora and the Paeonian kings minted their own coinage, a remarkable index of political sophistication and economic complexity, show the iconographic influence of Greek numismatic traditions while maintaining distinctly Paeonian imagery, a visual negotiation between local identity and dominant cultural forms. The meeting of the local and the Hellenistic, the persistence of identity within a framework of cultural exchange, adaptation, and pressure. This is the human story of the ancient Balkans, a story of resilience that is often compressed into the margins of broader classical narratives. You stand on the site today, and the landscape around you is one of the most quietly expansive in the Balkans. The wide valley, the river, the encircling mountains that give the whole space a sense of natural enclosure, as if geography itself is holding the past in place. The Paeonians who lived here saw these same mountains, this same river, these same seasonal rhythms of agriculture and movement. They organized their world around this geography with practical precision. They built their defenses to control these passes. They buried their dead, often in tumuli that dot the surrounding hills, mounds of earth over wooden burial chambers that echo broader Balkan and Thracian funerary traditions, preserving in their interiors the material evidence of status, martial display, and social hierarchy, including bronze, iron, and sometimes gold placed with the dead. The Paeonian language is almost entirely lost. A handful of inscriptions, scattered references, and a few words preserved in Greek and Latin sources survive only as fragments, names, glosses, echoes without full grammatical structure. The Paeonians had, in all likelihood, a rich oral tradition, myths, genealogies, and historical narratives that was never written down in forms that survived the successive disruptions of conquest and cultural change, or that survived only indirectly in later cultural layers. When Rome finally absorbed the region in the 2nd century BCE, the specific Paeonian cultural world began its long dissolution into the broader Roman provincial system, not through abrupt disappearance, but through gradual transformation. Bylazora was there through all of it, through the Macedonian conquests, through the wars of the Hellenistic successor states, through the arrival of Rome, and the reorganization of provincial life. The city's walls were repaired and extended. The urban space was modified to reflect new political realities and administrative needs. The material culture shifted from Paeonian to Hellenistic to Roman, in a gradual process whose exact chronology and internal dynamics archaeologists are still working to reconstruct layer by layer through excavation and comparison. What was it like to be Paeonian in the Hellenistic world? To maintain a cultural and political identity while surrounded by the overwhelming cultural gravity of Greek civilization and its institutions. To speak your own language, worship your own gods, follow your own customs, while trading with Greek merchants and hiring Greek craftsmen, and watching your children learn Greek as the language of commerce, administration, and prestige. This is a question that resonates across human history, wherever large cultural systems overlap with smaller, persistent identities, and it is asked with particular urgency here in this valley, where the traces of the answer lie embedded in the stratigraphy of a site still being excavated and interpreted. Bylazora has not yet given up all its secrets. The excavations continue, and interpretations shift as new material emerges from the soil. The valley holds its silence with the patience of a landscape that has seen many comings and goings and knows that the digging will reveal something, but perhaps not everything, and certainly not in final form. The Paeonians were here. They built something. They left their traces in the earth and in the patterns of objects and settlement. What they thought and believed and feared and hoped for, in this valley between the mountains, that remains, as it has always been, just out of reach, approaching only in fragments, never in completion. The word pyramid summons a specific image: desert, heat, the Nile's distant blue thread, the monumental grandeur of Giza. But pyramids, or structures that approximate the pyramidal form with remarkable closeness, are not limited to Egypt, not limited to Egypt's cultural sphere, not limited even to the ancient world as conventionally imagined. and not even to a single idea of what monumentality is supposed to look like. In the Świętokrzyskie Mountains of central Poland, there are mounds, Neolithic mounds, built from carefully gathered and arranged stones in a form that is unmistakably deliberate, trapezoidal from above, rising from wide base to narrower apex, constructed with a precision that speaks of organizational ability and technological knowledge that scholars have only relatively recently begun to fully credit to the Neolithic communities of this region, whose scale of cooperation is still being reconstructed from fragments. These are the structures sometimes called the Polish pyramids, though that name is contested, and archaeologists generally prefer more precise terminology that avoids the sensationalism the comparison invites. The most famous are the funnel beaker culture burial monuments, megalithic graves, dating to roughly 3,500 to 3000 BCE, making them roughly contemporary with the earliest phases of construction at Stonehenge and predating the Giza pyramids by perhaps 500 years, though arising in an entirely different ecological and social world. The form of these monuments is carefully chosen. They are not pyramids in the Egyptian sense. They do not terminate in a sharp apex. They are not sheathed in polished stone. They do not contain internal chambers of the Egyptian complexity or funerary bureaucracy. But they are funerary mounds built with an intentional geometric discipline, a concern for profile and elevation, an investment of community labor that transforms them from simple burial heaps into architectural statements that persist across millennia of environmental change. The largest examples, in the broader region of the Świętokrzyskie Mountains, stretch more than 100 meters in length and contain the remains of multiple individuals buried within carefully constructed stone chambers. Their scale is not accidental. It implies coordination, repeated effort, and a shared agreement about what the dead required from the living in material form. The funnel beaker culture, known in the archaeological literature by the German acronym TRB from Trichter-Becker-Kultur, was one of the most widespread and consequential cultural traditions of Neolithic Europe. Stretching across large parts of northern and central Europe, from Scandinavia to the northern European plain, it represents a phase in which farming societies stabilized, expanded, and began to express social organization through durable architecture. These were agricultural people, descendants of the long diffusion of farming practices from the Near East, and they expressed their relationship to their dead, their cosmology, and their sense of continuity with stone, earth, and mound, rather than perishable materials. The Polish examples are remarkable for their preservation and for the details they reveal about construction technique. The stone was gathered from the surrounding landscape, glacially deposited boulders, broken and selected for size and shape, and arranged in the outer facing of the mound with the care of builders who understood both the aesthetic and structural consequences of what they were making. The inner chambers, where the dead were placed, show evidence of multi-generational use. Bones were added over time, older remains moved to make room for newer ones, the monument serving as a communal tomb for kinship groups across long durations that likely exceeded the memory of any single individual. This is an entirely different relationship to the dead than the individual monumental burial of later, more centralized traditions. In these Neolithic chambers, the ancestors accumulated. They were present, collectively, in a structure that the living maintained and reopened, a place where identity was distributed across time rather than sealed at a single moment. The distinction between the living and the dead was not a final boundary, but a permeable condition. The dead were still here, materially close, their bones available to be touched, rearranged, or re-encountered as part of ongoing ritual life. What rituals took place at these mounds? The archaeological evidence suggests that the forecourt areas, the wide, open spaces in front of the burial chambers, were used for ceremonies, fire, feasting, deposits of ceramic vessels, repeated acts of commemoration that defined the relationship between community and ancestry, between present obligation and inherited past. The mound was not only a burial site, it was a place of return, a place where memory had architectural form and where time was periodically gathered back into itself. Walk across the Świętokrzyski landscape, an ancient landscape, as the very name of the Holy Cross Mountains encodes a sacred geography that stretches back into pre-Christian antiquity, and the mounds appear at intervals in fields and forest edges. Most are unremarked by ordinary visitors. They are simply there, absorbed into the countryside, softened by vegetation and centuries of agricultural passing. They do not announce themselves. They do not insist on interpretation. They remain even when their meaning does not. But they are extraordinary. They are the work of minds that understood the landscape as a medium of thought, that understood the dead as a continuing presence in the world of the living, that understood construction as a way of stabilizing relationships that would otherwise dissolve. 5.5 millennia ago, people stood on this ground and chose to make something that would last beyond the horizon of their own lives. It has lasted. What they believed, why this form, why this orientation, why these specific dead were gathered in these specific ways, has dissolved as completely as their language, their names, their immediate histories. And yet, the uncertainty itself has become part of what remains. Archaeology can trace structure, sequence, and material choice, but not intention in full. It can describe how these mounds were made, but not fully recover why this geometry carried meaning, or how it was experienced in the moment of its making. The silence is not absence alone. It is also the final condition of things that were once obvious and have ceased to be so. The mounds remain, patient, green, already here when later empires formed and dissolved across Europe, still here when modern fields were drawn around them, holding something in their stone cores that the grass covers and the wind does not reveal except in outline and shadow, and in the fact that they continue to exist at all. In the Roman coastal city of Ariminum, modern Rimini, on the Adriatic coast of northeastern Italy, there lies, beneath the streets and piazzas of the modern city, a layer of ancient life so complete and so precisely frozen in a specific moment of time that it constitutes not merely an archaeological site, but a case study in the fragility of civilization, memory, and human continuity. The Domus del Chirurgo, the House of the Surgeon. The name is not metaphorical. Discovered in 1989 during construction work in the heart of modern Rimini, the building has yielded the most extraordinary collection of ancient Roman surgical instruments ever found, together in a single archaeological context. 150 individual instruments, recovered in a concentrated deposit that speaks of a sudden, violent, irreversible event, and of a life interrupted without warning. They were not lost, they were left. The building dates from the mid-2nd to mid-3rd centuries CE, the High Roman Imperial period, a time when Ariminum was a flourishing city on the Via Flaminia, one of the great roads connecting Rome to the northern reaches of the empire. The house was large and well appointed, mosaic floors, painted walls, carefully arranged rooms, the architecture of a prosperous urban establishment, and its occupant, or one of its occupants, was a physician. A surgeon, specifically, if the instruments are the guide, and the instruments are an extraordinary guide. The surgical instruments from the Domus del Chirurgo represent virtually the complete toolkit of a practicing Roman surgeon: scalpels and lancets, forceps and probes, hooks for extracting tissue, spoons for scooping, a meningeal elevator for lifting membrane during brain surgery, instruments for obstetric procedures, needles and threading tools for suturing. The collection covers the full spectrum of surgical practice as it was understood in the Roman world, a practice that was, by the standards of its time, sophisticated, empirically grounded, methodical, and surprisingly effective in certain domains. This was not primitive medicine, though we are sometimes tempted to assume so. The Roman physician worked within a tradition that stretched back to Hippocrates, had been enriched by the Alexandrian medical school and its systematic approach to anatomy and physiology, and had been synthesized into the comprehensive medical system of Galen, the physician who towered over ancient medicine and whose influence extended in Western medical practice until the Renaissance. The surgeon who owned these instruments would have known Galen's works, would have followed his methods for wound management and surgical technique, would have approached the body with a systematic intellectual framework that, while it contained errors we can now identify, was nevertheless the product of centuries of empirical observation, accumulated practice, and disciplined study. The instruments are beautiful. This is worth saying plainly. Roman medical instrument makers were craftsmen of the first order. The handles of iron and bronze, sometimes inlaid with silver or decorated with geometric patterns, have a quality that suggests pride in the tools of the trade and confidence in the profession that required them. A scalpel that is beautiful is not a mere instrument. It is an argument about the dignity of the work it performs. The physician who carried these tools advertised, through their quality, his own status, his own seriousness, and perhaps even his understanding of medicine as both science and discipline. And then came the crisis. The instruments were left in their deposit, apparently in haste, in the context of what appears to have been a fire. The building burned. The dating of the conflagration has been connected by some archaeologists to the turbulent mid-3rd century CE, a period of extraordinary crisis in the Roman world, when multiple emperors rose and fell in quick succession, when the frontiers were under constant pressure, when epidemics swept through the population, and the social fabric of the empire began showing the strains that would eventually lead to its fragmentation and transformation. Perhaps the physician fled the fire. Perhaps he was already gone when the fire came. A refugee of the broader social catastrophe, his instruments abandoned in a building he no longer occupied. Perhaps he died in the fire and could not return for them. The archaeology does not say. What it preserves is the aftermath, the sealed layer of destruction, the instruments within it, the testimony of a medical practice suddenly interrupted and abruptly silenced. You look at the forceps behind their museum glass and think of the hands that held them, the specific hands of a specific person, trained in a specific tradition, who spent years handling these tools with the practiced ease of the skilled practitioner. What did he treat? What surgeries did he perform in that house with those instruments in the flickering lamplight of the Roman world? What patients walked through that door, or were carried through on stretchers, crying out from wounds or disease, or the complications of childbirth? What recoveries were achieved, and what losses grieved in silence behind those walls? The Domus del Chirurgo preserves a medical practice, but it also preserves, in the sudden silence of its destruction layer, the specific tragedy of a practitioner separated from the tools that defined his life's work. The instruments waited. The physician did not return. Whether the surgeon's hands, those specific hands that knew these specific tools, found another way to practice their art in the chaos of the 3rd century, that question has no answer. The fire took what it took. The earth preserved what it preserved. And what the earth preserved is enough to make the absence of the rest unbearably precise, painfully human, and strangely immediate across the distance of nearly 2,000 years. 10 million years ago, on a warm afternoon in what is now northeastern Nebraska, the sky turned the wrong color. The animals grazing on the ancient floodplain, rhinoceroses, horses, camels, the extinct 3-toed protohippus, the extraordinary barrel-bodied teleoceras, would not have had language for what they were seeing, would not have had the context to understand it. The ash began to fall, somewhere far to the west. In what is now southwestern Idaho, a massive volcanic eruption, the eruption of what geologists call the Bruneau-Jarbidge supervolcano, sent cubic kilometers of ash into the atmosphere, and the prevailing winds carried it east, across the ancient Great Plains, to settle on this watering hole in Nebraska with a gentleness that belied the catastrophe it represented and concealed the devastation already moving invisibly through the air. At first, perhaps, it did not seem deadly. Ash drifting downward like pale snow, a strange haze in the distance, the dimming of sunlight, the taste of dust in the mouth and throat. But volcanic ash is not soft in the way snow is soft. Under a microscope it is jagged, abrasive, particulate glass. The landscape itself had become dangerous to breathe. The animals breathed the ash. The fine silica particles entered their lungs and began the slow, suffocating process of destruction. They gathered near the water, instinctively, as animals do when stressed, clustering near the waterholes and springs that the volcanic event had initially left intact. They died. They died by the hundreds, by the thousands, and the ash continued to fall, deep and soft, covering them where they lay in the postures of their dying, nursing mothers with their young beside them, individuals collapsed mid-stride, animals in the social configurations of their last moments, entire groups preserved in the ordinary intimacy of herd behavior. And then they waited. 10 million years. The Ashfall fossil beds of Nebraska are one of the great natural wonders of the paleontological world, a site where the accident of preservation has created what scientists call a Lagerstätte, a site of extraordinary fossil preservation, a window into a specific ecosystem at a specific moment with a completeness and precision that the normal fossil record almost never provides. What makes Ashfall unique among such sites is not merely the abundance of fossils, but their three-dimensional completeness and their extraordinary articulation. These are not flattened impressions or scattered bones. These are animals preserved essentially as they died, three-dimensional, fully articulated, in the positions they occupied at the moment of death. A rhinoceros mother with her calf lying beside her. Horses collapsed on top of one another, their social bonds preserved in the proximity of their dying. Birds, turtles, fish, small mammals. An entire ecosystem caught in the act of its ending and held there by the silent accumulation of volcanic ash. The rhinoceroses at Ashfall, primarily teleoceras, a short-legged barrel-bodied beast that resembles a modern hippo more than a modern rhino, adapted to a life of grazing on the wet grasslands of the ancient interior, are the most dramatic presences. More than 100 individuals have been excavated, ranging from calves to mature adults. Their bones show the characteristic changes of pulmonary hypertrophic osteopathy, a condition caused by lung disease that produces distinctive bony growths on the limbs. The pathology is unmistakable. These animals were suffocating slowly, their lungs destroyed by silica, their bones recording the progression of their illness in the very substance of their skeletons. This is a diagnosis made 10 million years after the patients died, reconstructed from the quiet testimony of fossilized bone. The site preserves not merely death but sequence. Earlier, victims lie deeper in the ash deposits. Later, victims higher above them. Smaller animals died first. Larger animals lingered longer. Some rhinoceroses survived for months after the initial ashfall, breathing damaged air, drinking contaminated water, weakening gradually beside the shrinking pools where they had gathered for safety. The fossil layer records not a single instant, but a prolonged catastrophe unfolding in stages. You walk through the Ashfall Fossil Beds State Historical Park today, and the scale of it presses on something deep in the imagination. The excavated area lies beneath a protective building, the Hubbard Rhino Barn, and inside, the fossils emerge from the ash matrix in their original three-dimensional positions, partially excavated, the surrounding matrix left in place to show the context. It is like walking through a frozen moment, a moment from 10 million years ago, preserved with a completeness that ordinary time almost always destroys. What did the great inland landscapes of Miocene North America look like, spreading away from this watering hole? The ancient Niobrara River flowed differently then. The Rocky Mountains were still being uplifted, the rain shadow that would eventually create the American Great Plains, not yet fully established. The climate was warmer, much warmer. The interior filled with forests and grasslands and lakes that have since disappeared. The fauna, including an array of creatures that would seem fantastical to modern eyes. Camels walked Nebraska. Three-toed horses ran across plains that had not yet become the wheat fields of the future. Ground sloths grazed alongside mastodons in a world that was already ancient then, but is entirely lost to us now, except for moments of catastrophic preservation like this one. Moments in which disaster accidentally became memory. The Ashfall event lasted perhaps weeks. The damage to the lung tissues required months to kill the larger animals. So there was time, a terrible, extended time, when the animals at this waterhole knew, in whatever way animals know such things, that something was wrong, that they were weakening, that the normal rhythms of existence were failing. Did the rhinoceros mother stay close to her calf through that extended dying? The evidence suggests yes. The bond preserved in the rock is 10 million years old and still recognizable, still emotionally legible across an almost incomprehensible span of time. Catastrophe preserves what time erases, and what it has preserved here, in the deep ash of a Nebraska hillside, is not only bones, but something more difficult to name. The specific texture of an ancient afternoon, a world going about its business, unaware that the sky was about to change everything. A watering hole becoming slowly and invisibly a place of extinction. That world cannot be recovered. but something of its reality has been returned to us by the accident of the ash, and that something is enough to make the 10 million years between then and now feel, for a startling and deeply unsettling moment, almost navigable. There is an island at the northern edge of the British Isles where the wind comes off the sea with a force and a consistency that shapes everything: the architecture, the agriculture, the psychology of the people who have lived here for 10,000 years. The Orkney Islands, a low, treeless archipelago at the junction of the North Sea and the Atlantic, where the sky takes up more visual real estate than the land, where the light in summer lasts so long that it becomes a different quality of darkness rather than true night, and where winter is a long conversation with the dark. And in this landscape, more than 5,000 years ago, people built things of extraordinary ambition. Maeshowe is a chambered cairn, a passage tomb, constructed around 2800 BCE, making it roughly contemporary with Stonehenge and the pyramids of Giza, and placing it squarely in that extraordinary period of Neolithic monument building that transformed the landscapes of Europe in ways still only partially understood. It sits in a flat area of the Orkney mainland, surrounded by a roughly circular ditch, its outer profile a gentle grass-covered mound that gives no outward indication of what lies within. From a distance, it appears almost modest, another rise in the landscape shaped by wind and weather, concealing beneath that simplicity one of the most sophisticated monuments of the European Neolithic world. Enter through the long passage. You must crouch. The passage is low, the stone on either side coming close, and the space expands. The main chamber rises to a corbelled ceiling of remarkable sophistication, the overlapping stone courses stepping inward and upward to create a stone vault that has remained stable for 5,000 years. 3 side cells open from the main chamber. The walls are constructed of enormous flat slabs of local sandstone, some of them 5 meters long, fitted together without mortar with a precision that testifies to extraordinary skill. The air inside carries a peculiar stillness, a silence shaped not merely by enclosure but by time itself, as though the chamber has become accustomed to waiting. And then, once a year, something happens that cannot be accident. On the days around the winter solstice, the setting sun aligns perfectly with the passage entrance and sends a shaft of golden light directly down the long passage to illuminate the back wall of the main chamber. The shortest days of the year, the moment when the sun's retreat reverses and begins the long journey back toward summer, warmth, life. And on those days, at that specific hour, the interior of Maeshowe, the dark stone chamber where the ancient dead were placed, fills with light. This is not coincidence. This is architecture speaking. The builders of Maeshowe aligned their monument to capture this specific astronomical event, to encode into stone the cosmological significance of the solstice, the death and rebirth of the year, the victory of returning light over the darkness that must have felt in this northern latitude, genuinely threatening in its winter intensity. The dead were placed where the solstice light would reach them. Whatever that meant to the builders, it meant something profound, something worth building a monument of this scale and precision to express. The alignment is so exact that even now, thousands of years later, modern observers gather to watch the same brief illumination that the builders intended. The construction of Maeshowe required an understanding of the local terrain, of the astronomical alignment, of the structural principles of corbelled vaulting, and of the logistics of quarrying, transporting, and placing multi-ton stone slabs with precision. All of this in a Neolithic society, without metal tools, without writing, without the institutional frameworks of state organization that we usually associate with such achievements. The people who built Maeshowe were farmers, herders, fishermen. They had domesticated cattle and grew cereal crops and lived in stone houses in villages nearby. And they built this. They measured the movement of the sun across the horizon closely enough to anchor eternity to it. The chamber was opened and its original contents disturbed in the Norse period, probably the 12th century CE, when Norse visitors broke in through the roof. They left their marks on the walls. The Norse runic inscriptions at Maeshowe are, in their own right, extraordinary. More runic inscriptions in a single location than anywhere else in the world. The Vikings who sheltered here, or explored here, or looted here, scratched their names and their boasts and their small observations into the Neolithic walls with the casual confidence of people who did not understand what they were entering. One inscription says, "Ingigirth is the most beautiful of all women." Another speaks of treasure. Another, "These runes were carved by the man most skilled in runes in the Western Ocean." The Norse words sit beside Neolithic stone, the gap between the two civilizations spanning roughly 3,000 years, and the Norse visitors, with their runic literacy and their longships and their world-spanning trade networks, were no closer to understanding what Maeshowe was than we are today. Their graffiti survives because the monument itself survived, absorbing generation after generation of human curiosity without surrendering its deeper meaning. Why were the dead placed where the solstice light would find them? What was the relationship between the dead, the solstice, the light, the darkness, and whatever these Neolithic people understood about what happens after death? The chamber says something. It says it every winter solstice, in a language of stone and light, but the words are in a vocabulary we have not yet learned to read. The light enters, the back wall brightens, the moment passes. Outside, the Orkney wind continues across the fields, as it has for millennia. And Maeshowe returns to its ordinary darkness, holding its knowledge with the patience of something that has outlasted every question ever asked of it, and expects to outlast all future questions. 2. On the Baltic island of Öland, off the eastern coast of Sweden, in the 5th century CE, something terrible happened. Something so sudden, so complete, so final, that the people it happened to left no survivors to describe it, no survivors to bury the dead, no survivors to carry away the valuables, the food, the animals that were left behind in the instant that everything ended. Sandby Borg is a ring fort, one of many such circular earthen and stone fortifications built across Scandinavia in the Iron Age and Migration period, the turbulent centuries that correspond to the decline of Roman power in the West and the great reorganization of peoples that transformed the face of Europe. From the outside, it presents as most ring forts do, a circular rampart enclosing a habitation space, the construction a combination of earthwork and stone, the whole settlement compact and defensible, a community arranged in a ring with its center protected and its perimeter defined, a place built with the assumption that walls and kinship and preparation could hold danger at bay. What excavations since 2010 have revealed at Sandby Borg is not what ring forts usually yield. The people who lived here did not leave. They did not pack their valuables. They did not bury their treasures for safekeeping and flee to return later. They died where they were, in their houses, in the streets, in the open spaces of the fort interior, and their bodies were left where they fell. The gold remained, the food remained, the animals, also killed, remained. Whatever came to Sandby Borg in the 5th century came with a totality of violence that permitted no departure, no recovery, no normal aftermath. The settlement did not decline gradually. It stopped. Archaeology calls this a massacre site. The forensic evidence is clinical and chilling. Skeletal remains scattered across the settlement in positions inconsistent with burial. People struck down in doorways, in the street, inside their own homes. Evidence of perimortem trauma, injuries inflicted at the time of death or immediately before, on multiple individuals. The distribution of the dead across the settlement suggests that the attackers moved through the fort systematically, killing as they went, leaving none alive. And then they departed, leaving the dead behind, not bothering to take the gold, not taking the gold. This detail requires attention. Archaeological sites regularly preserve precious metal objects because they were hidden or lost. At Sandby Borg, gold objects were found in positions suggesting they were simply dropped at the moment their owners died, or left in the spaces where they were stored, because no one survived to come back for them. A gold bracteate found in the open floor of a building, a gold ring, silver jewelry, the precious metal objects of a community's accumulated wealth left in the ruins of its ending. Wealth so suddenly disconnected from the people who valued it that it ceased in an instant to function as wealth at all. Why? What were the attackers after, if not plunder? What motivated an attack of such thoroughness and apparent disinterest in the wealth of the community? The interpretations are multiple and contested. Political conflict within the complex chieftain politics of 5th century Scandinavia. Revenge. Ritual violence connected to the cosmological upheavals of the migration period, a time when the old order was being remade across the entirety of Europe, and new power structures were asserting themselves with the violence that always accompanies the death of one world order and the birth of another. The 5th century was a period of extraordinary instability. Attila's Huns were pressing against the borders of the Roman world. The Roman Empire in the West was entering its final decades. Across Europe, populations were moving, alliances shifting, kingdoms collapsing and reforming. In Scandinavia, the climate event of 536 CE, when a volcanic eruption or asteroid impact threw enough material into the atmosphere to dim the sun and cause widespread crop failure, was approaching, an event that would trigger demographic collapse across much of northern Europe and fundamentally transform the political landscape. The world in which Sandby Borg was built was a world under pressure, and pressure has a way of turning neighboring communities into enemies with terrifying speed. The gold bracteates at Sandby Borg are themselves objects of considerable mystery. These thin gold coins, stamped with images that combine Roman imperial imagery with emerging Germanic iconographic traditions, depict human figures, animals, and symbols that connect to the Norse mythological tradition. The earliest material evidence, some scholars argue, of the iconographic vocabulary that would eventually produce the images of Odin and the world tree and the great cosmic drama of Norse cosmology. The people who wore these objects understood themselves within a mythological framework, a cosmology that was in the process of being formulated in this very period. The symbols around their necks connected them to stories about fate, power, ancestry, and the structure of the universe itself. That cosmological framework did not save them. The mythology did not intercede. The gold remained, and the bodies remained, and the fort stood empty for 1,500 years, while the grass grew back and the island continued its quiet existence in the gray Baltic. The dead were not properly buried. The settlement was not resettled. Something about what happened at Sandby Borg may have lingered in local memory long enough to make the place untouchable. You walk the ring of the rampart today, and the island spreads around you, flat, agricultural, Baltic in its subdued quality of light and land. The wind moves through the grass. The sea is never very far away. Nothing announces what happened here. Nothing in the landscape says, this is where something ended in a specific hour of a specific day in the 5th century, and the ending was total, and the gold was left, and no one came back. What did the attackers see when they were done? Did they look at the bodies and the gold and the abandoned animals and feel what they had made? Did silence settle over the fort immediately after the violence ended? Or did they simply leave, as the archaeology suggests, without ceremony, without explanation, leaving the question of what happened here to be suspended in the Baltic air for the next 15 centuries, unanswered, unanswerable, waiting for the trowel that would find it, and the mind that would finally, partially, begin to understand? They have been sitting in the same position for 3,500 years. 2 massive stone figures, each standing approximately 18 meters tall, the largest surviving statuary of ancient Egypt outside the temple complexes, set on the west bank of the Nile across from Luxor in the landscape that the ancient Egyptians knew as the place of 1,000,000 years, the vast desert necropolis where the pharaohs buried themselves in tombs cut deep into the limestone cliffs, where the temples of millions of years lined the edge between cultivation and desert, where the living and the dead maintain their relationship across the annual rhythm of flood and withdrawal. The Colossi of Memnon. The name is Greek, and it is wrong. The Greeks, who encountered these figures in the centuries after Alexander's conquest of Egypt, identified them with Memnon, the legendary Ethiopian king who fought and died at Troy, the son of Ios, the goddess of dawn, slain by Achilles. The identification was an error of cultural translation. The figures represent Amenhotep III, one of the greatest pharaohs of Egypt's 18th dynasty, who ruled in the 14th century BCE, and who built, on the site just behind these seated colossal guardians, a mortuary temple so vast that it was the largest ever constructed in Egypt, larger even than the temples at Karnak, its ground plan stretching across an area that would encompass almost every other major Egyptian temple. That temple is gone, dismantled across subsequent centuries by later pharaohs who quarried its stone for their own construction projects, reduced eventually to a foundation scatter and occasional fragments of statuary, its scale now reconstructible only by archaeology and by the evidence of the colossal guardians who stood at its entrance. The colossi remain because they were too large and too remote to be easily moved. The temple behind them is a ghost. The statues, seated patiently before emptiness, have outlived the very monument they were created to announce. But in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, the northern Colossus had a voice. An earthquake in 27 BCE had cracked the statue, and in the centuries that followed, this cracked and damaged figure produced, at dawn on certain mornings, particularly mornings following cold nights, a sound, a singing, a ringing that ancient visitors described as the sound of a broken lyre string, or of a voice, or of a bronze instrument struck. The Roman emperors came to hear it. Poets wrote about it. travelers crossed enormous distances for the experience. The inscription record on the statue's legs and base, hundreds of Greek and Latin inscriptions left by visitors across the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, constitutes one of the most remarkable visitor books in history, attesting to the awe, the piety, and the simple human delight with which the ancient world responded to a stone statue that appeared to speak at dawn. The phenomenon was almost certainly caused by the thermal expansion of the stone as the morning sun warmed it, the crack in the statue allowing gas or temperature-related stress to produce the eerie vocalization. But explaining the mechanism does not diminish the experience. Thousands of people, including emperors and poets and ordinary travelers, stood before this figure in the gray light before dawn and waited for the stone to speak. And sometimes it did. That experience, the combination of the ancient, the vast, the mysterious, and the suddenly animate, must have been, in every sense of the word, overwhelming. To hear a monument already ancient by Roman standards answer the sunrise with a sound of its own must have felt like contact with something suspended between architecture and divinity. The voice stopped in 199 CE, when the Emperor Septimius Severus had the statue repaired. The restoration silenced the singing. After that, the Colossus fell quiet, and the pilgrimage traffic that had sustained an entire local economy of guides and souvenir sellers and inscription carvers gradually diminished. The silence that followed the repair is itself a kind of statement. In trying to fix what was broken, someone erased what was miraculous. The emperor restored the monument's appearance and accidentally destroyed the phenomenon that had made it alive in the imagination of the ancient world. Amenhotep III himself remains one of history's most accomplished and, in many ways, most interesting pharaohs. He ruled for approximately 37 years in an Egypt at the absolute height of its international power and prestige. His diplomatic correspondence, the Amarna letters, the great cuneiform archive that his successor Akhenaten inherited, reveals a pharaoh engaged in sophisticated power politics with the great kingdoms of the Near East, exchanging daughters and gold and sophisticated intelligence with Babylonian and Mitanni kings, managing a network of client states and alliances with the assurance of a ruler who understood and perhaps enjoyed the complexity of international affairs. His reign was marked not only by diplomacy, but by enormous artistic and architectural ambition. Statues of Amenhotep III once stood across Egypt in staggering numbers, presenting the image of a ruler who understood kingship as something cosmic, ordered, radiant, intimately tied to the stability of the universe itself. The mortuary temple, guarded by the Colossi, was intended not merely as a burial monument, but as a machine for preserving royal memory across eternity, a place where rituals would sustain the divine identity of the king forever. And yet his great mortuary temple, his dust, his statues, and there were hundreds of them. He was the most represented pharaoh in the archaeological record before the field of study grew dense enough to make such claims provisional, are scattered across the world's museums. And these two colossi sit in their field, enduring the seasons, watching the Nile continue its indifferent passage, preserved by the very accident of their scale. They were meant to guard something enormous. They now guard an absence. What was the pharaoh's intention for this place in the period of his 1,000,000 years? What ceremonies were performed in the shadow of the temple that is now only a scatter of stone? What hymns were sung there at dawn before the floodplain heat rose over the western desert? The Colossi know. They have been keeping the secret since before Rome was founded. They are not, apparently, in any hurry to share it. She was buried with everything a ruler needed: weapons, war clubs, a shield, gold objects of extraordinary craftsmanship, necklaces of human and owl-head beads alternating with human faces, all in gold and gilded copper, spondylus shells brought from the warm waters far to the north, and on her body, the tattoos of a warrior, complex designs covering her arms and legs in the imagery of supernatural beings and power animals, the visual vocabulary of the Moche aristocracy rendered permanently on her skin. She was a woman. She ruled. And for the better part of a century after the first Moche sites were excavated, scholars insisted she could not have existed. The Lady of Kao, as the burial's occupant has been named, was discovered in 2006 at the El Brujo archaeological complex on the northern coast of Peru, in the Chicama Valley, at a site that had been an important Moche ceremonial center from roughly the 3rd to the 7th century CE. The Moche civilization, one of the most sophisticated pre-Columbian cultures of South America, had been known from archaeological work stretching back to the late 19th century, and the elaborate ceramic tradition of the Moche, depicting in astonishing anatomical detail everything from erotic acts to warfare, to the preparation of food to supernatural ceremonies, had given archaeologists an unusually rich visual record of Moche life and ritual. But the interpretation of that visual record had been filtered through assumptions. The warrior priest figures depicted in Moche iconography, presiding over the elaborate sacrificial ceremonies that appear on ceramic vessels with detailed narrative specificity, were assumed to be male. The high-status burials at Moche sites, accompanied by weapons and regalia of power, were assumed to be male. The Moche political structure was assumed on the model of many other complex societies to be predominantly patriarchal. The evidence was there in the art itself, but the expectations of modern interpreters shaped what they believed they were seeing. The Lady of Kao changed that. Decisively. Her skeleton was that of a woman in her late 20s, young in our terms, for someone who had evidently accumulated substantial political authority. The weapons were not ceremonial. They showed use-wear. The regalia of power was real, not symbolic copies left for the afterlife, but the actual objects of rule. And the position of her burial, at the pinnacle of a ceremonial mound at one of the most important Moche sacred sites, was the position of someone at the absolute apex of the social order, someone whose authority had been publicly recognized and ritually affirmed. She was found accompanied by 2 other bodies, women, apparently sacrificed at the time of the lady's interment, 23 war clubs, 2 scepters of gilded copper, sheets of metal that may have been thrown across her body as a final offering, the care of the burial, the quality and quantity of the grave goods, the deliberateness of every detail. These speak of a community conducting the interment of its most important member, ensuring that everything she needed for the afterlife would be present, ensuring that the dignity of the occasion matched the dignity of the life it was marking. Even in death, her status remained unmistakable. The tattoos preserved on her skin are among the most remarkable details of the burial. Snakes, spiders, supernatural motifs associated in Moche cosmology with fertility, transformation, power, and the mediation between worlds. Tattooing of this complexity and visibility was almost certainly not decorative in the modern sense. It was communicative, ceremonial, a declaration written directly onto the body of someone whose physical presence itself carried authority. The Moche ceramic tradition had, it turned out, depicted women in positions of power all along. Scholars had simply not been looking for them. Female figures in the ceramic scenes, previously read as servants, attendants, or subsidiary participants, are now being re-examined. The possibility that female political and ritual authority was more widespread in the Moche world than previously understood has opened new interpretive possibilities across the entire record. One burial forced an entire civilization to be reconsidered. El Brujo itself, the name means roughly the wizard, is a complex of multiple pyramidal mounds associated with different phases of use, some predating the Moche period, some post-dating it. The main ceremonial mound, Huaca Sao Viejo, preserves on its exterior walls the remains of polychrome painted reliefs, figures of warriors and captives, supernatural beings, the iconographic program of a ceremonial center that conducted, among other things, the sacrificial rituals that the Moche ceramic tradition so unflinchingly documents. Even now, the surviving pigments retain traces of their original intensity beneath the desert light of coastal Peru. The sacrificial practices of the Moche are among the most dramatically documented in the pre-Columbian world. The ceramic vessels depict, with the matter-of-fact specificity of a culture that found nothing shameful in these acts, the capture of warriors in battle, their presentation before a presiding figure, the ritual throat-cutting, the collection of blood in goblets, the presentation of those goblets to the presiding official. This was not hidden. This was performed publicly at the foot of the huacas, with an elaborate ceremony that connected the sacrifice to the cosmic cycles on which agriculture and human survival depended. Violence, ritual, and political authority existed together within the same sacred framework. Did the Lady of Kao preside over such ceremonies? The iconography of her burial regalia suggests exactly that. She was the presiding figure, the warrior priest, the axis around which the ritual world turned. In her late 20s, tattooed with power animals, ruling a world where the relationship between violence, sacrifice, and fertility was not a paradox, but a theology. Who was she? Where did her authority come from? Was it inherited? Was it earned? Was it both? What alliances and rivalries shaped the world she governed? What was her name in the Moche language, a language we cannot read because the Moche had no writing system? She lies in her museum now, or her reconstruction does, surrounded by the objects of her authority. She is still there, and the questions she raises about power, about gender, about the stories we tell ourselves about the ancient world, those questions are very much alive and getting more interesting with every new excavation season. In the ancient city of Vidisha, in the Madhya Pradesh region of central India, a city of profound historical depth that served at various times as a regional capital, a trade nexus, and a center of artistic and religious production, there stands a gateway that time has treated with characteristic ambivalence, preserving it partially, obscuring it partially, leaving just enough to make the imagination ache for the rest. The Hindola Torana, the swinging gateway, a Toranic gateway, a ceremonial arch of the type familiar from Buddhist monumental architecture, most spectacularly represented in the great gateways of Sanchi, standing in isolation now, its context of the larger structure it once adorned, largely dissolved into the agricultural fields and urban sprawl of modern Vidisha. But the gateway itself, in its fragmentary survival, carries an extraordinary artistic and historical charge. Even separated from the monument it once announced, it retains the unmistakable authority of a threshold meant to matter. The Torana form is one of the foundational vocabularies of Indian monumental architecture. The great carved gateways of Sanchi, barely 20 kilometers from Vidisha on a hilltop visible from the city, are among the masterpieces of world art. Their 4 gates covered top to bottom with carved reliefs depicting the Jataka tales, the life of the Buddha, scenes from the natural world rendered with an exuberance and a joy in visual narrative that seems almost to burst from the stone. The Hindola Torana belongs to this tradition, or to its slightly later evolution, sharing the basic architectural grammar, 2 vertical pillars supporting horizontal crossbars, that defines the Torana form across its centuries of use. The structure is at once architectural and symbolic, not merely an entrance, but an announcement that the space beyond has been transformed by ritual and meaning. The carvings of the Hindola Torana are fragments of what was once a comprehensive decorative program. What survives includes figures of Yakshas, the voluptuous, auspicious female nature spirits who appear across Indian religious art from roughly the 3rd century BCE onward, their bodies full and curving and insistently alive. Their association with fertility and abundance, making them appropriate presences at gateways, both literal and metaphorical. They stand in the Tribhanga posture, the triple bend, the body's natural S-curve that Indian sculptors understood as the embodiment of life and movement, and they carry with them the quality that the great Indian art historian Ananda Kumaraswamy described as the life of the forest, the teeming, sensual, exuberant vitality of the natural world pressed into carved stone. Even weathered by centuries of monsoon, heat, wind, and neglect, the figures retain a startling softness. The stone still suggests skin, movement, ornament, gesture. Indian sculptors of this period understood something fundamental about how to make carved bodies feel inhabited, not static representations, but forms caught in the act of becoming. The Yakshi does not merely stand at the gateway, she seems to emerge from it. Vidisha in the centuries before and after the Common Era was a city of considerable prosperity and cultural sophistication. Located at the junction of the Bez and Betwa rivers, it was a node in the trade network that connected the Gangetic heartland to the Deccan and the western ports of the Indian Ocean trade. Merchants and craftsmen, pilgrims and officials moved through this city with a cosmopolitan ease that the material culture of the period, the coins, the ceramics, the sculptures, reflects in the breadth of its influences. Greek, Persian, and local Indian traditions overlapped and synthesized here in the Hellenistic and early Kushana periods, producing artistic forms that are simultaneously deeply Indian and touched by the wider world. The question of who commissioned the Hindola Torana, which religious community it served, which larger structure it once adorned, is not definitively resolved. The area around Vidisha contains traces of Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain monuments from multiple periods, and the Torana's iconography has been variously interpreted. The Yakshi figures suggest Buddhist or Jain associations, since these nature spirits appear frequently in the monumental art of both traditions. But the syncretism of the period makes simple categorization unreliable. The same artistic vocabulary could serve multiple religious purposes, and the boundaries between traditions were more permeable in this period than later developments might suggest. Sacred art moved between communities more fluidly than modern categories comfortably allow. You approach the Torana in the late afternoon, when the western light gives the stone its warmest tone, and the carved figures seem to breathe a little. The Yakshi leans from her stone with the same triple bend she has maintained for 2,000 years. The birds and foliage around her are worn but still legible. The crossbars above are incomplete but present, their carved surfaces still carrying traces of the narrative or decorative program that once covered them. The silence around the structure sharpens the sense of absence. There should be more here. Walls, courtyards, pilgrims, ritual movement. The gateway still performs the emotional work of arrival, even though the destination itself has vanished. The gateway leads, theoretically, functionally, from one space to another, from outside to inside, from the profane to the sacred, from the ordinary world to the world of the monument. But the monument the Hindola Torana once introduced is gone, absorbed back into the earth, and the gateway now leads only into an open field, a gateway to nowhere, or a gateway to a space that once was somewhere, that was once defined and sacred and significant enough to merit this extraordinary carved threshold. The somewhere is still there, in the sense that the ground still holds its archaeology, its foundations, its layers of use and abandonment. The somewhere is accessible, in principle, to those with trowels and patience and the willingness to read the earth. But the spirit of the place, what it felt like to pass through this gateway with the intention of entering sacred space, to pass beneath the Yakshi's gaze in the carved abundance of the lintel and feel oneself crossing a threshold that mattered. That experience belongs to a world that has moved too far from us to fully reconstitute. The gateway is present. The crossing has been made. What lay beyond the arch is a question the carved stone cannot answer, and the open field will not say,